well, I can't say good evening, good afternoon, depending on where you are. It is 1 o'clock, 13:00 Central European Time. That's where Malta is. I hope many of you have heard of Malta. It is because this is a mixed group. We have people coming in from different parts of the world. Definitely, as is appropriate, from East Africa, because we're celebrating an East African, Julius Nyerere. I'm Peter Mayo, and I hold the chair, supported by many others.
I'm Peter Mayo, and I hold the chair.
Yeah, why do I have a repetition?
Many others.
Okay, Joseph, what's this repetition?
Okay, sorry.
All right.
It was the live stream.
Okay, all right. I hold the UNESCO Chair in Global Adult Education. And because of the word global, we make a lot of use of Zoom and all these platforms and whatever engines to get a global, to give a global dimension to our activities. As a chair, we have already relaunched a flagship journal for the adult education movement, which is Convergence. We are now adding, as it was originally, an international education journal, because there are other journals which came into being after this Convergence, and so that we won't be confused. So we've already produced 2 issues online, open access, also available on our website, the chair's website, as will be the recordings of this meeting and the recordings of the 2 we had last year. Last year we did Paulo Freire over 3 days, because we had a lot of participants in that one, and over 1 day, Raymond Williams. And now we're doing Julius Nyerere, known as Mwalimu, the teacher, the learned one. And of course, apart from the journal, we are now converting our adult education and Masters of Arts into a, not open access, of course, but into an online course, which can be accessed globally. So we can get our book series with now it's Brill takeovers as well, as usual with books. It also carries the logo of the chair, because now they also come out under the aegis of the chair. And we have about over 32 books, international issues and adult education. I know Bud Hall has a couple of books in that series, and one on social movements for sure. And yeah, so there's something else, but I can't remember what we've been doing, but that's what most of our work right now. So this is part of a series of activities, global activities, which fall under the activities of the chair. And now it is Mwalimu, 100 years since his birth. That's why we often do it by November, December, before the year is out. What can I say about Mwalimu, which will not be said during this meeting? Mwalimu Nyerere, of course, is a very important figure in the global adult education. I mean, it's part of his Education for Self-Reliance, and I recall a statement from the first development plan in Tanzania. Tanzania cannot wait for today's children to become tomorrow's adults for development to begin. So that placed a lot of emphasis on adult education. I stand to be corrected here, because I know there are people much more well-versed than I am and who know the context. That's a very important part, and to live in that context. It was a big struggle to provide primary education, let alone secondary education in Tanzania, because there was nothing after independence, as usual. It's only a small elite which will be educated by the colonizers. And he made a great effort. We must run while others walk, putting pressure on the bureaucrats to get universal primary education by 1977. Stand to be corrected, but I believe he succeeded in that. Secondary education was a bit of a privilege, was like what we call sponsored mobility. And therefore, it is interesting about for primary education, what were the goals of primary education, but also the onus placed on adult education. And here we have speakers who were at the heart of it, okay? At the heart of what was going on in adult education in Tanzania. And of course, I don't need to elaborate on this because the speakers themselves will be doing so. Okay, and the great work which came out of there, the great research which came out in the form of participatory action research. Okay, I'm sure Bud is going to tell us about this. The agricultural colleges, the influence of the Scandinavian folk high schools, but given an African character, you know, like reinvention, not transplantation, etc. And the strong anti-colonial stance or decolonizing stance, because really you cannot be 100% anti-colonial. We are very much, you know, we have to come to terms with the structure. And that was extremely important. I know there are very, very strong parallels between some of his ideas and ideas which were floated around in Malta around in the 70s, etc. Relationship between education and work. I always use Nyerere as a classical example. And I know he was also personally a good friend of our former prime ministers, one of whom just passed away. Knew him personally because of their involvement in the non-aligned movement. In fact, one of the things we don't hear much about in my part of the world, which is the Mediterranean and Europe, is education for non-alignment, and which I think Nyerere has probably provided quite a contribution. I don't know. So that's something worth taking up. Anyway, without further ado, Dean cannot come, cannot make it. So I'm moving along. We have two people who have to pull out at the very last. Simfree Makoni, who on the program is the last to speak, and Yusuf Kassam. They both had family issues, whatever. Okay, but the rest are all there. We have speakers from different parts of the world. We have speakers from Tanzania, from Kenya, from Canada. We would have had the United States if Simfree Makoni was on, and also from Europe, from Germany, in particular, Heribert Hinsen was a very household name, I suppose, also in Tanzania because of his research about Tanzania, adult education in Tanzania. He was the former director of the German DVV International. Anyway, our first speaker today is, well, I'll introduce you. Joe Vansel is our anchor person, more than just a technical person. He's an academic in our faculty, handling also open access online learning. Right now we have a master's degree program, and that's what I'm teaching on. I'm teaching on this, which is all distance learning. So it's about higher networked higher education. But anyway, we are very interested to hear about the interesting things which have happened at, in Tanzania, university system, University of Dar es Salaam, all the progressive things that we'll be hearing about. The first speaker is from Tanzania, and I just communicated with her, and my eyesight is not very good, okay? I've had an accident a couple of years ago, and they have not removed the oil from my eyesight, which is important to do, so I can't see properly. So I'm trying to read the small letters here. Okay, it is Anna Grace. Anna Grace, I cannot pronounce as you probably cannot pronounce mine. So Anna Grace is the first one. She's from Tanzania. I think it's fair that we open with somebody from Tanzania itself. So Anna Grace, the screen is yours. Hello, Anna Grace. We've just communicated. Okay. Anna Grace.
Yes. Hello.
Hello.
Hello. Good afternoon. Good evening, everyone.
Yes, the screen is yours.
Yeah. Thank you.
Can you just first tell us the title of your program? Is it different from the program itself?
No, it's the same. Self-development, democracy, and intersectional.
Over to you. You got 20 to 30 minutes. Come on, because we've got two people.
Yeah.
Oh.
Thank you. My name is Anna Grace from this, as you have heard. I am presenting how I've met Nyerere's experience in philosophy, not as an academician, but as a person working in the community. So that's where I met Nyerere, and I've been meeting him, his ideas and his views and philosophy and his beliefs. Since my childhood, I've read, heard, and listened about Nyerere's speeches, lots of them. They never made real sense to me personally until I started working in the community. And especially that I carry into the speech that I carry into my heart whenever I go to the community is Nyerere's self-development and democracy, which made real sense to me through the work that I've been doing in the community, where he says, people cannot be developed. They can only develop themselves. A man develops himself by what he does, by making his own decisions, by increasing his understanding of what he's doing and why, by increasing his own knowledge and ability, and by his own participation as an equal and in the life of community. This sentence this speech I've been carrying along with me for so long, especially when I'm in the community, like right now, because most of the time we normally tend to think that people, especially in the community, on the ground level, they need to be educated. And they have little understanding of things, especially those things that we introduce to them, the big concepts that we bring to the community. So we believe that we need to educate them, we need to enforce them, we need to make aware of them, and just like that, and force them to do what we tell them to do. And we carry the belief that we do not do it for them. And sometimes we have to do it for them to understand, instead of just letting them do it. But Mwalimu insisted we have to allow people to learn, to do how they understand their own way, to do the things that they understand. Even if it's the concept, bring it to them so that they can, dilute and digest that, not dilute, digest that information, digest that concept, digest that idea that you are bringing to them. They make their own decisions, they make their own mistakes. That's where Mwalimu Nyerere makes me so happy, that people have the right to make their own mistakes, just like many leaders do. We don't, not all the projects are successful at the village level. We do lots of mistakes and assumptions. So for him, he was insisting that people should know how to do it, should be let to participate at their own, at their own level, at their own context, to understand the issue and be able to act. That's the true democracy that he was trying to explain. There is a saying that it's possible for an outsider to build a man's house, but he cannot make that man feel proud of that or confident about that house. So this is what we carry. When we do animation into the community, we carry this as a soul of animation. We call animation as uragbish. At first, they confuse it with participatory action research, but we say, no, this is not only participatory action research. It has lots of it. It has the person who is going to the community, the ideas, the first reflection, the conscientization that you carry, and the ideas and beliefs that you carry with you to go into the community. and then the process that you use to engage the community to be able to believe into themselves, to get confidence and be able to stand up and participate in whatever they are participating. So it is a belief that people have their own knowledge and way of doing and understanding things according to their context. This is what we call animation. So in carrying this belief, we are carrying Mwalimu Nyerere's belief and philosophy of people can never be developed. They can develop. If you carry this belief that people have their own experience, they have their own knowledge, then they can do things on their own way. It's one way or one step of supporting the community to be able to stand up for themselves and do their things on their own way. In animation, our core work in the community is working with a group of people that formal education could not yield more fruits, or they could not benefit from formal education. Most of them have left school for so long. Most of them, maybe the education was not provided to them as according to their capacity, according to their positionality in the community that they live. So, but we carry this belief that from far on, they say, if you want a person to understand it, they will definitely understand. And this goes together with the way believing that when you really want people to understand anything, they will understand. And therefore, this belief stands back the responsibility to the person who is working into the community. I can give you one of the experience that I am in Shinyanga right now. We are working with the community surrounding the mining communities. We have a group of people, the young people who are in these communities. We have been working to them. We train them in animation, and then they go into the community because they are believed they are their own people. This is their own person. Then they understand the language so easily. They use different methodologies for them to be able to understand. Recently, we had a very team from high level. It is a team making international grievance mechanism. It includes lawyers, retired judges, they use those languages, those big people. And then we had to use these animators and their methodologies. They were going together in the community to introduce that process. The way they introduced that process in a very, very simple way, in a way that the community could understand. Even this team, big team, said, no, you see what, we couldn't do it on our own. We couldn't do it the way you have done it. So this makes sense that if you really want people to understand, then they will understand. It depends on what you believe and what you carry and what you are ready to go down there at their level. And also we carry the principle or the thinking or the belief that how do we provoke this kind of thinking, like Paul Freire said, like you conscientize people. How do you do that? By using only simple methodology, only simple question. It's not by you just being able to talk a lot, and being able to, you think maybe you'll be understood by that way, but you just question one thing to provoke the way people are thinking, to make them think and internalize and reflect on their own and be able to say, okay, now this is what I'm thinking, this is what I'll be doing. This kind of adult education, this is what Mwalimu Nyerere meant when he especially invited his friend Freire. By inviting Freire into education, that kind of education which he believed that is a kind of education that builds knowledge that have already built into the knowledge that have been already possessed by the people, strengthening their self-confidence and desire to act within the context of their mutual learning and understanding. So I believe that education, animation is the way of putting Nyerere's beliefs. This is what we have been doing. Putting Nyerere's belief and philosophy into practice. Nyerere did not tell people, for instance, that you have to plant trees, but he went there. of course, right now it's not easy that every reader will just lead by demonstrating, but most of them, they think that telling people what to do is what the meaning of leadership is. The meaning of, we tend to say, creating awareness and sensitizing people. But in animation, we believe that, you have to believe. First of all, you have to believe. And when Nyerere was speaking about adult education, of course, he included those people who did not benefit from this formal, the normal education that was the systematic education that was put in place. But for animation, we say we carry this and we take the step further. We go to the community. What kind of community? Now that's where intersectionality comes in. Of course, by that time of Nyerere, intersectionality, we could say this terminology was not there. Maybe this concept was still very far from him. But going back to the communities, understanding that the class issues, the positionality issues, but the different kind of powers and that come together and suppress or oppress a person. So for us, we carry animation and we add listening. What kind of person are we listening? We go to the communities that have been less marginalized and left for so long, that have been marginalized because of the not being able to benefit from the formal education, that have been not reached by the social services. So this creates the kind of lack of confidence, and they feel like they need to depend on the government, they need to depend on other people to bring them the ideas, and most of the ideas they fail because they keep on saying it's a government issue. It's the government toilet, it's the government tap water. So for us, we just create this kind of sense of responsibility and conscientizing, critical thinking on what do you really need and how can you participate into this, to put your idea, to put your knowledge and protect this as your own. Although I could still argue that Mwalimu Nyerere's concept of intersectionality, it was very young, it wasn't there by then, but he failed on one way, although he understood, he acknowledged that there are lots of power, especially patriarchy power that oppressed the women, but he did less to take action on that. So this is my personal experience, and I've worked with different organizations like TJP, and to take this action to take this philosophy into the community. I could see how women used to stand up. At first, I didn't really understand so well, but later on, the way you see women are participating, they stand up to express themselves, to defend for their rights, to demand some of their accountability and responsibility from their government and from their leaders. I feel so much at peace, and I feel so much at a place that I actually am carrying Nyerere, and this is what Nyerere was intended for the community, intended for the leaders to understand, and intended for the nation, as a nation, to carry with us as a style of leadership. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello?
Peter, can you switch on your...
I've muted myself. Now I'm muted. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes, good. Rehumziba, right? Anna Grace Rehumziba. I excuse my pronunciation. I don't know Swahili. So, but I'll make an effort. Now, I know there are a lot of questions about this, and I would love to ask some questions too, but I will not hog it. But according to the plan, we'll listen to another group of speakers. Now we've got three all in one, and then we'll have a discussion. And I'm sure there's going to be, for me, living outside Tanzania, and I'm sure others would never or did not have the experience that you have had in Tanzania. We only read it, we get to know this stuff from literature, etc. We have quite a number of questions to ask, I'm sure. Our next group is Mwalimu Ruiza, Kael Martin, and Ahmadi Kipacha. I hope I did justice to your surnames and your names,
Yes.
of my pronunciation. Nyerere, how by looking back, Africa can move forward. The screen is.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. First of all, let me say that I am the beneficiary of Nyerere's education system. I'm now a lecturer at the university, but I have never paid a single cent through my schooling, from my primary school, free education, secondary school, free education. I went to university, free education, and I also went to the national service, and then university, free education. So as you can see, I'm the beneficiary of the Nyerere's legacy, but not now. Most of them now I have to pay. But for me, I enjoyed it, having that. So to begin with, our topic, first of all, I'm representing Nyerere Knowledge for Change Hub. This is a hub, we call it Nyerere under his name. And we are based in Tanzania, and I'm also part of the Nelson Mandela African Institution of Science and Technology. This Nelson Mandela African Institution of Science and Technology is the idea behind Nyerere and Mandela. So it's a public university, and we have 4 types of university or institution of that nature, which was initiated by the idea of Nyerere and Nelson Mandela. So we are still continuing with their legacy, and we are proving that their legacy is still alive. Our topic, we want to look at Nyerere from a historical point of view, and we'll just have anecdotes, very few anecdotes, a few slides, but we are hoping that they will signify Nyerere history and Nyerere legacy, and it can also give us a lesson to Africa and to move forward. Okay. Now, we can, historically, we cannot equate Nyerere away from Tanzania's history. We are saying Tanzania has 4 major historical epochs. We begin with ancient Tanzania or Tanganyika, 1 BC to 115. We have history, which can be recorded, of course. And also we have a colonial history from 15 to 1961, which has also been recorded. Persian rule, Portuguese rule, Oman Sultan rule, German rule, British rule, etc. But we begin Nyerere era in 1962 to 1985. This is the era which we are placing Nyerere, and therefore we cannot divide Tanzania and Nyerere. And we are also talking of post-Nyerere era. So 1985 is the post-Nyerere era. So we can basically say Tanzania has four epochs which are actually dominated by Nyerere. And when we talk of Julius Nyerere era of 1961 to 1985, we can see that, first of all, he spearheaded independence in 1961, but he also supported revolution, January 1964 with Zanzibar, and also the union of Tanganyika and Zanzibar was done on 1964, and then later on 1977 we saw a political party which was ruled in Zanzibar and the political party of Tanganyika united into CCM, and was still ruling the country to date. But at the same time, Nyerere is also acquitted with freedom struggle in Southern Africa. He also reintroduced multi-party system, and also the South-South Commission chair, and also an ardent member of non-alignment movement. So these are, we can say in nutshell, things that Nyerere has played a significant role in Tanzania. We are not saying Nyerere is a freedom fighter, but a freedom keeper. The word freedom, uhuru, is everywhere in Tanzania. We talk of Uhuru Torch, we talk of Uhuru Peak in the mountain, we talk of Uhuru. So Uhuru is everything. And there's one thing which he has done on his first days is to tell people that Uhuru ni kazi. It's not, Uhuru means work, working hard. So that is the first definition he gave to his people, to the people of Tanzania. But he wanted to make a case for Uhuru, and it's relevant to the people of Tanganyika. So there is also a need for him to define, he wanted to define what actually Uhuru means. And in contemporary Africa, most of the elite leaders require you to justify why you need Uhuru. But for Nyerere, Uhuru was something more than that. So we are talking to him, we are concerning him as a freedom keeper, but not a freedom fighter. And he also unites. The one thing which people say is what went right in Tanzania. There's one book which is saying what went. One thing which went right in Tanzania is uniting people through one language. As you can see, Tanganyika or Tanzania had many ethnic groups, more than 120 ethnic groups. But most of these have been united deliberately by Kiswahili. So, and now Kiswahili is becoming the African lingua franca, not only in Tanzania, but also in East Africa. It's the language of, which also is going to be the language of Africa very soon. So, but of course it has, now there is still a challenge. We are in limbo. We don't know between English and Kiswahili. So we are still divided. We're still very divided to put Kiswahili in its mark. But the debate is still going on, and very soon I think this limbo will be solved as we move on, because most of us now we can see that Kiswahili is encroaching or is used in many parts of the official domains in Tanzania, but it's still the question of English is also at par with it. Your country cannot be led by if it has interfaith or ethnic disparity. This is what Nyerere has. So on the first few days of his office, or the first few days of first few years of his leadership, Nyerere ensured that interfaith, interethnic marriages or cohabitation is legally bounded. So you can either have ethnic, faith-based, but also interfaiths, which is something which has helped the country. But also what he has done, apart from being himself a staunch Catholic, he decided that he will nationalize all faith-based institutions. And this was a move which was done in 1967, and which we feel that this kind of move is the one that actually has solidified the country, has unified the country. But today, we still see in sub-Saharan Africa, or even in Tanzania, it's not unusual to use religion as a factor for one to be elected, not to be elected into a government office. So this is still the issue, but it has solved. As you can see, the picture of Zanzibar here. This is the live picture. You see the mosque, you see the cathedral there, you also see interfaces in Zanzibar. And that is something which Nyerere wanted to. People should live in harmony despite having different faiths and also different colors. In terms of race, and he actually, Nyerere, found, inherited a country with a fragmented political struggle. There were a lot of European association, several association, and African association. We were divided in terms of locality, in terms of the schooling, in terms of the hospitals, etc. But Nyerere made sure that all this slowly is dissolved, and also the country is becoming one. The picture of the first government, the government capital, the government cabinet, the first government cabinet is is a rainbow sort, because they were all people of different Europeans, Indians, and Africans, all in the same cabinet. But Mwalimu Nyerere was also sure that race is not to become an issue in Tanzania, and he fought for that. In terms of Africa, Nyerere thinks of an injury to one is an injury to all. Mwalimu did not think about the independence of Tanganyika as a separate from the independence of other African nations. And this is something which we have shared. I've donated blood myself to freedom fighters. And we were living alongside with them. We were living with them, living in Morogoro and the other part of the country. And also we felt the branch of fighting for southern part of Uhuru in other countries. And we cherished when Mozambique got its independence, South Africa got independence, and all other countries in Southern Africa. And this was part of us, that we felt that they are part of us. And this is now, of course, we feel that after most of the countries in Africa have got to independence, but we have some elements of individualist Africa of today, plagued by civil war and political tension. We can learn from Nyerere that this was not the way. And I think if Nyerere was here today, actually would have feel very, very awkward about it. In nutshell, I can say what we can feel that apart from being a man born from and raised from Butiama in Tanganyika, but also went to Makerere University and also University of Edinburgh, and this has also shaped him, because by being in Tanganyika, being schooling in Tanganyika, then moving to East Africa, and then moving to Edinburgh, this has internationalized him as a scholar. And Tanganyika and indeed Africa was at Nyerere's heart. But the great African statesman was not oblivious of the global affairs. He was very close to, as we know, to Oliver Palmer, Kennedy, and many others, etc. And of course, we have also seen that Nyerere was a socialist, has planted a socialist ethos in our country. And we are still regarding ourselves, Tanzania, as a socialist country. And therefore, the beginning of 1967 was actually a landmark of a socialism installment in Tanzania. And although we can say that we are moving to social democracy, but socialism is still a signal that that country is signified. Yes. Concludes. We can have few issues to signal what is Nyerere's legacy. And first of all, we look at Nyerere's when he said to preserve national and individual freedom. Nyerere wanted us to unite as a nation using a common language. Do not use religion or ethnicity to be a reason for division and conflict. Peaceful means equal opportunity and human respect. And also Nyerere thinks of Africa as one, and Africa must reach out. And the international community is also important. So this is the conclusion we can say about Nyerere. Let me end up here and listen to your comment. Thank you very much. Okay.
Peter?
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you very, very much for the presentation by the three of you. And now we are opening the floor for discussion about any issues you'd like to raise from the previous speaker, Anna Grace, and Ahmad. Sorry, Anna Grace, and you are Ahmad Kipacha.
Yes.
Yes, okay. So any
questions
and queries, I suppose. Many of us have queries because we don't live in Tanzania. So, you know, you can clarify things for us. So, okay, go ahead. Anybody would like to start? So this is our time to ask questions. Who would like to go first? All right, I'll just ask a question. You know, my knowledge, limited knowledge of Nyerere and Tanzania derives from his own writings and studies about his ideas. I've never been to Tanzania and I would love to have been there, especially during his time. So my first question is to Anna Grace. No, actually to both of you. For example, I followed the whole process in the speeches of Nyerere of the creation of a university in Tanzania. I remember you were once a university college with the University of London, then you became part of the University of East Africa, and then there's a famous, and that's also represented by a speech, and then there's also the speech of the transition to the University of Dar es Salaam. This was a big thing, and I was working on a book on higher education, and of course I refer to Nyerere a lot, because a lot of the literature on communities and university refer to Nyerere. Because of he's quite instructive in terms of how the university must respond, not to international market needs only, but particularly to community, which is a quite a departure from the kind of discourse we hear from the Western world about the university today. Is how much of that, I was surprised to hear factually that now you have more than one university. The Nelson Mandela is a university, a degree granting institution, or just research? The institute. I mean, that's interesting. It means like the higher education, as in all places, has expanded, not just confined to that. That's my understanding from what I gathered. And the other question concerns, in this age today, which is the post-Soviet Union period, where, you know, like you have competing globalizations, competing imperialisms, as we can see with Russia. However, is it possible, no matter how noble the ideas of Nyerere are, okay, but it's not the noble ideas, unfortunately, which survive in this age of neoliberal globalization. would it be possible to retain that kind of political orientation in this day and age? I can see the difficulties and unfortunately the compromises that will have to be made, because you will get very little backing in the international. I can go, I can break that down to details, but I think you understand what I'm trying to say. Because we also had the same thing in Malta. Non-alignment, Don Mintoff, personal friend of Nyerere, Carmenu, Mr. Bonici, non-alignment, neutrality in our constitution, all these kinds of things that higher education closely related to the work process. Some people said there is a lot of Nyerere. He actually says, Mintoff, it came from America, that, but changed the politics, rather than run by capitalists, the education work relationship run by workers. So, but that was a different world. That was Cold War kind of world, where you play the dangerous game of playing off one against the other, which Mintoff did. Today, it's a different scenario. How much of Nyerere can be salvaged in today's reality, today's world? Not a very good world, I suppose. Not a healthy world. So, would you like to go to that?
All right, maybe shall I respond to a few of this?
Oh.
Yeah, first of all, I would like to say that higher education in Tanzania the issue of how higher education respond to community. Our university or our institution, this is specifically for masters and PhD students. But what our motto that we put in that institution is education for community and also for industries. We ensure that every student or every researcher who is doing his work, the work is related to the community. And we have also ensured that they work on the surrounding areas. So all the topics or all the study which they are doing is within those areas. So in one way or another, it's part of responding to Nyerere's quest for HE to be for community purpose. But on the other hand, well, let's look at the enrollment. Let's look at how the government is doing at the moment. Expanding, we have a number of the public institutions, higher education institution. In terms of primary school, yes, we have done very well. And moving on to secondary school, yes. Of course, we are still looking back at whether our graduates from primary school or secondary schools are really self-reliant, because Nyerere is talking about self-reliance. So we are really thinking, and even we have a lot of discussion right now of even going back and changing the system, or even the 7-4 or something system, to change it to something which is more relevant, and also putting more effort to technical schools, et cetera, et cetera. So there are things which we haven't been able to grasp what is actually Nyerere was aiming at when he was talking about education for self-reliance. We are not really, our graduates are not really self-reliant per se, especially primary school levels. And this is something which the government is working on at the moment, and the debate is still going on in the parliament. But as far as the issues of new liberalization, well, as Tanzania is a non-aligned country, well, I think we have played our card well so far. So far, we have played our card well because we are having both worlds on our side, and we are not being pulled into one camp. And that has helped us a lot. But we also need to learn, because the global now is becoming one village. Therefore, we cannot play the card of having two divisions. We want to get the best out of everywhere. And that is something which any clever government could be doing. And but for legacy of Nyerere, especially the legacy of language, I think that is where we can hit the nail at the jackpot, at the head. If we manage to use Swahili throughout the whole system so that people can understand. And we're not saying that English should not be there. English should be taught very well, but majority of our people speak Swahili, and they need to understand. So our research should be in Swahili, and it should be able to communicate to the people's language. So far, we are not, it's not the knowledge that we gather at the higher institutions are not trickling down to the community so far. We have a number of theses, but all banked in libraries. And of course, most of them are useful, talking about local medicine, traditional medicine, and all sorts of things, but they are not trickling down to the community. So we are still somewhere there.
It was always a challenge. That's always.
Yes.
Anybody who would like to come in? Yes.
Yes, I would love to
Catherine,
join the
Catherine.
conversation.
Hi, Catherine. Catherine
Can
Hopper.
I go ahead?
Yeah. I'll say, yeah. Marjorie,
Okay, thank you.
Who's going to speak? It's Catherine. Hi, Catherine.
Yes, thank you.
And Marjorie, let's take Marjorie first, because she's been raising her hand.
Okay.
Then Catherine afterwards.
Who is going?
You go, Marjorie.
Myself. Sorry,
Yeah.
I'm not good at hearing.
Good to see you after having
Okay, thank you.
in Convergence many times.
Yes, I wanted to pick up on this conversation, and I'm grateful for the two presenters as well. I think that what Anna Grace was talking about in terms of animation, which is how many of us interpret Nyerere's understanding of adult education as liberating education, and with the idea of Freire as well, working in the community with people, analyzing their own situation, deciding on priorities and taking action. And indeed, this has been embraced by several of our organizations. Anna Grace has mentioned in her paper, such as Tanzania Gender Networking Program. So I would really like, because for many of us, Nyerere combined his concepts of participatory education, animation, pedagogy, with the idea of participatory democracy. In all of his writings, he's talking about how people can educate themselves, listen to them, pay attention to them. But he also said, teachers, go out and work in the community and be a part of the African Revolution. You're not neutral, you are part of the struggles, and that includes struggles against neoliberal globalization. So I really would like to invite my sister, Anna Grace, if you can share concrete examples of how you have been putting this into practice. I didn't quite hear it in the presentation. I think if we just had one example of how it is possible to work at local level with women or other categories of people who are in definitely oppressed communities and are able to organize themselves and fight against oppression. To us, I think that is how we understand it, because we link neoliberal globalization to patriarchy and the intersectionality between those, which is, I think, another theme in Anna Grace's presentation. Thank you very much.
Okay, Anna Grace, will you respond to that? Yeah, I got a still image.
Thank you very much, Margie, and the community.
we carry this with participatory methodologies. We listen. First of everything that we carry big ears, where we believe that listening is one way of empowering, especially the most marginalized, the people who haven't been heard for so long. We give them power to be able to realize that, okay, so we matter, because they've ignored for so long. And I believe that formal education, just like the previous presenter said, it leaves, because it is in the language that's not understood. So it leaves people like feel like they've been discriminated against of that education system, or been stigmatized. So they feel they're not confident enough to be able to participate into especially women, especially those who have been marginalized for so long. So when we go there, we use participatory methods.
It's not good.
Methodologies. They analyze. The only thing that we do, and what do you think this is, and why? How do you understand?
Joe, can you help with is the connection or what?
Shall we put?
Maybe if she turns off her video. Maybe if she turns off her video.
Oh, should we turn the might be on? Maybe mute.
Yeah, there's a communication issue. Often happens. Let's put it this way. I can turn off my video. I tell you, let's do it this way. Maybe Anna can speak later. I think we have time, and we'll move over. Anna Grace. Your voice is not coming through clearly because of some technical issues. What I suggest you do is you defer your comment until later, maybe where the reception is much better, and we move over to Catherine, and then we'll see how it works with you. Sorry about this, because we were very interested in what you had to say. So, Catherine.
Yes, thank you so much for convening such a powerful seminar.
Yeah, of course, we invited you to be a speaker. We invited you to be a speaker.
Yes, but I couldn't.
You can't.
I would like to make some comments. Maybe all of us can think about it.
Prioritize. Why do you think this is?
We'll have to tell. We'll have to. I don't think Anna Grace is hearing us. So,
so in that process, they tell
Anna Grace, we are going to defer you to later. We're going to postpone your intervention because there are technical issues. So let's listen to Marjorie, and then we'll come back to you eventually when the connection is much better from your end. So go ahead, Catherine.
Yes. I want to make some comments in that, Nyerere was like my father, actually. He dealt a lot with my loved ones. My brother, the ex-president of Uganda, Dr. Milton Obote, they were so close. They were so close. And, you know, nobody refers to them anymore, but I remember. She's still talking?
Yes.
Okay.
Who were close? Can you repeat who were close? Nyerere and Mr. Obote?
Milton Obote.
Obote, yeah. And
Yes.
I imagine.
Yes. For me, Nyerere is a transformative leader par excellence, because a transformative leader is defined as a leader intent on attaining social justice outcomes for societies. So they lead people-centered processes in order to achieve social justice ends. So looked at it from that point of view.
Matters a lot.
Anna Grace, we haven't been hearing what you were saying because there's something wrong with the connection. Joe Vansel, please come in. Joe, our anchorman, where is he? Anchor person. Joe, you have to be muted, Anna Grace, because the connection is good. So
I don't think it was Anna Grace.
It is
because
Anna
she's
Grace, yes.
muted.
Yes.
Okay, therefore it is Catherine now. So Catherine,
Okay.
please go ahead. My apologies.
Okay. I was carrying on that his transformative essence can be picked up in the grounding philosophies that embrace everyone, interpersonal relations, Pan-Africanism, given a very practical example in Tanzania, globalization from Africa's stand, for example, you know, Nyerere and languages and so on. But now, Nyerere passed on to us now to take these themes or these grounding philosophies is a basis for us to continue, not just repeat,
Reinvent.
but so that we continue with other themes that afflict Africa and the world. You get me? So for me, I've been taking up the issue of indigenous knowledge systems, using the grounding that Nyerere gave me, that Obote gave me, that Kaunda gave me. So, you know, these leaders were almost my heroes, you know? So using the grounding perspectives I got from my upbringing and so on, I managed to take the issue of indigenous knowledge systems and take it almost to almost beyond academic and the policy arenas, to transforming the whole academy itself in South Africa and globally, actually. So I thank Nyerere and I thank Obote, I thank Kaunda, because they give me such grounding and I can face the world direct, you know? I'm not scared. I'm not scared at all, even in espousing themes that are not popular, but I'm grounded enough to take them on. So I would like to offer my thanks to Peter for convening this, and the 2 or 3 people who have spoken. Please continue, because you give me, you reinforce my courage. You reinforce it. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks to you. Thanks to all of you, especially because we are getting voices from different areas from which I, as a Maltese, have to learn. Just to give you one example, I'm sure people from all over the world. We're ahead of time, actually, so we have more time for questions if you want, because we did away with most of the formalities in the beginning. So would anybody like to intervene? We've raised important issues here. I mean, Catherine is talking about confidence, the confidence to speak what is considered to be dangerous knowledge, what is not spoken. Yeah. Yeah, we have somebody. Am I seeing Iris from the Philippines? You want to speak, Iris? Unmute yourself. Unmute.
So I have a question. Like Peter, I don't really know that much.
Let me introduce you. This is Iris De Campo. She's based in Glasgow now.
It's Tallinn.
In Tallinn.
Tallinn.
Yeah. But she's from the Philippines.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So I guess because I also come from a country where we have that is very diverse, like Tanzania, and we have many languages. And I want to ask because of what I know what happened in my own country. I want to ask how the promotion of the use of Swahili affected the diversity of the languages in the past decade. Were some languages, some other less minor languages, huh? Yes, yeah. So, but were some other minor languages actually? What happened to them? Were they also promoted, or were they less used, or some other indigenous languages? Please not to share with me, Peter. I'm whispering to me. Yeah. So what happened to the other indigenous languages as Swahili as one language was promoted? What happened to the rest?
Of the indigenous knowledge, the indigenous language like Swahili.
Languages. Because Swahili was promoted, right, as one language.
You took my question. That was a question I would have asked. What about the minority who don't speak Swahili? What kind of adult education provision, given the context of this seminar, is provided for the minority who don't speak Swahili?
Especially since Swahili was being promoted since the 1950s. What happened to the minority languages over the past 50 years? Did they survive as well? I mean, the more you promote one language, the less another is used. So that standardization affects, of course, the lesser used language, the minority ones.
Can you answer that question, please? Our 2 speakers. What about the other minority languages? Did they survive? Or did they become endangered species, to use the language which is often used in this context? And I would add to that also what kind of adult education provision, which I'm sure there is, knowing Nyerere's writings, are in place or were in place or have been in place to bring people who do not read, who do not know Kiswahili to understand Swahili, since there was a great effort in promoting Swahili as the language also of education. So, 2 questions in one. Okay, who would like to go first? Anna Grace, would you like to answer this? If the connection is correct now. And Ahmed, where are you?
Right. Let me begin here by saying that Well, it's a very good question. But one thing that you should note, we are multilingual. One of the features that has marked the Tanzanian, mostly Tanzanians are multilingual, not bilingual, multilingual. They speak Swahili, they speak English, they speak other languages. But we divide ourselves in terms of domains. Public domain is solely for English and Swahili. And now English and Swahili are fighting for each other to dominate the public domains. But in terms of private domains or private sphere, it is still our local languages. And in some area, of course, in some areas, if you go, for instance, because we have almost 4 types of languages, those Bantu languages and all those Cushitic languages and et cetera, et cetera. So if you go to some areas, you really find it's difficult even for Swahili. Swahili is also becoming a new language to most of the people, to the children themselves. So it's a way of implanting to them multilingual setting in schooling. So they learn Swahili just like what they learn English. And for them, sometimes English is much better than even Swahili. I went to some areas like in northern part of Tanzania, especially in Arusha, where you see those kind of features. Yes.
What did they teach there in Arusha? English or what?
They teach they teach Swahili and English. They teach Swahili and English, but they have to communicate. The student teachers from students for themselves, they have to communicate using their local languages to clarify matters in local languages. For instance, Mbulu, you see speaking Maasai, speaking on their own languages. And if you go to Sukuma, they're speaking their own languages, etc.
So these are minority languages.
Minority languages, yes.
Promoted still.
Yes, yes.
That's the question.
It can't easily go away. It can't easily go away because it's part of their life. It's part of the culture. The language also defines itself. So multilingual setting is hybrid. We can talk of hybridization of the people themselves and their languages and even their
Arabic is one of them.
Yes, yes, yes.
I remember
Arabic not in the sense of speaking Arabic per se, but they learn Arabic from Islamic, from the Quranic Arabic. Quranic Arabic is very
because as you were presenting earlier on, we all got a message from Anna Grace.
Yes.
Thank you. Shukrani.
Asante.
That's Arabic. Shukran.
Yes.
Thank you. So maybe they, as you said, hybridization. I see even from Nyerere's writing, some words, binadamu mandeleo.
Yes.
I can understand the son of Adam, a human being, a man, so a human being, sorry, man or woman. There's also this kind of intermeshing of different languages. I don't know. From what I read. So when I saw this word shukrani, this is Arabic. Shukrani means shukran, which means thank you, as you know. So it entered Kiswahili. Yeah, yeah. We have many loans words from not only Swahili, not Arabic. Arabic is a bulk of our languages. We have borrowed from Arabic, bulk of it. And some also English is also part of it. French is also there. Portuguese is also there. Hindis, almost Hindis. What did I say about shukran? Thank you, it is actually. Yes, thank you. Maybe I made a mistake. Somebody just said this, obrigado, from Portuguese. Yeah. I mean, I hope I said thank you. If I didn't, it was a lapsus. Yes, that much Arabic I know. Because we have many Arabs here, as we have many people from Africa, in the part where I live. mostly from Nigeria, Somalia, you name it. There's a very strong African contingent here right now, especially in the southern part of Malta they live. Anyway, yeah. Okay, if the next speakers are around, we're ahead of time, we can move. Isn't Jockey around?
Richard would like to
intervene.
Richard has his hands up.
Richard, I couldn't see. Richard, okay, go ahead, Richard. Okay, unmute.
Thank you very much. I'd like to comment on two things. Firstly, on the
My
language
apologies,
issue.
I didn't notice you. I didn't notice you, Richard. Sorry, because they're all small boxes around. So, okay, go ahead. Thank you.
It's okay.
Shukran.
Firstly, on the language issue, it's interesting that the three groups that Ahmed mentioned, the Wambulu, the Maasai, and the Wasukuma, are the three groups which, when Nyerere was fighting for independence, where he had to use an interpreter. The only three groups where he had to use an interpreter, and those languages remain strong. And there is a debate. There is a debate about whether at primary school, at the beginning of primary school, people should learn first in their own languages, especially in those areas where they do not speak Swahili and they do not come into contact with Swahili on a day-to-day basis. The biggest debate, which is interesting because it's one on which Mwalimu Nyerere changed his opinion, is whether English or Swahili should be used as the medium of instruction in secondary schools and moving up to higher education later on. Originally, Mwalimu said that English is the Kiswahili of the world, and that we should maintain using English as the medium of instruction. That was when only about 5% or less than 5% of students went from primary school to secondary school. So in 1995, he said that he knows instruction. And that goes with the fact that once you expand secondary education, and now we're aiming for universal secondary education, you have to change the language policy to make sure that students understand what they are studying, because that goes with his commitment, Nyerere's commitment to education for self-reliance. You can't be self-reliant in a language you don't understand. Nyerere wanted critical thinkers. You can't be a critical thinker in a language that you are not conversant with. And even in 1982, before the great expansion of secondary schools, research showed that only 10% of Tanzanian students in secondary school had enough English to study all their subjects in English. So actually, the language debate is not just a fight between two languages. English, which is the language of the elite, is disempowering the majority of Tanzanian children. In relation to minority languages, I agree with Ahmed that they continue to be used, and if Anna Grace manages to get a chance, all debates, all discussions in the community are carried out in Kisukuma, because that's their language, and no one is forcing them to do it in Swahili, although politicians, when they are campaigning, are not supposed to use other languages. When you come to secondary school, the vast majority of students are fluent in Swahili. Whether they have no Swahili or not when they started primary school, by the time they get to the end of primary school, they have enough Swahili to be able to understand all the subjects in Swahili. So the debate is, oh, we need English because English is the international language, which is really the language of elite. And then what is the purpose of education? Do we want people to learn? Do we want people to have skills? Do we want people to have critical thinking? And if we do, then they should be taught in a language that they understand. That is the principle of education. Learning another language is not the first principle of education. Understanding is. The second thing I wanted to comment on was in regard to your question about can we maintain the same ideas that Nyerere was promulgating in the 1960s and 1970s. I think his ideas have been a great inspiration, as been seen in certain organizations that have carried his ideas forward. And the debate about what kind of education we want, both adult education and school education, are still infused with Nyerere's ideas. But I think that if we look at it from the intersectionality point of view, Nyerere believed that you could move to socialism without the formation of classes in between. And in the Arusha Declaration, and in education for self-reliance, and in adult education, all of them, we tried very hard to convince people that if you are a leader for the people, not a leader above the people. And through the leadership code in the Arusha Declaration, which banned leaders from having double salaries, businesses, and so on, he tried to stop the tide. Unfortunately, in this particular one, I think he was a bit like King Canute, because the sea keeps on coming in, whether you tell it to stop or not. And the ruling class continued to get stronger and stronger until they rejected his ideas in the Zanzibar resolution. So I think that, and I think Anna Grace mentioned it, I think that the issue of class was not really addressed. He addressed race, he abolished racial schools and so on, and he addressed religious intolerance. He talked in favor of women, but the structures which maintain the development of a class which controls those below them, he was unable to do. And so I think these are the ideas that we are trying to continue by working with the community and work upwards from the community, when he was trying to convince the leaders that they should behave in a certain way. And once they have established themselves, unfortunately, most leaders do not. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Just to clarify, when I said how much of it is that, it doesn't mean I endorse Mwalimu's teachings. In fact, I teach his ideas at university in Malta, you know, but it's the world which we're living in today with imperialism, American imperialism. Is it going to allow this to happen? That was my concern. It's not the validity. I know they're very valid as a counter logic to capitalist development. They're very valid, and I always use Nyerere's ideas also in my own work. But it's the general international climate of the multinationals and the United States, etc., which makes the scenario very different for this to survive politically. I mean, that was my concern.
No, I understood that, but and unfortunately, you have national elites which link to the capitalist system,
exactly,
and work with them, which is the whole imperialist situation.
Yes, yes, and of course, with the point you made about his idea of a transition to socialism without going through capitalism, got him into hot water with the Socialist International. But anyway, that's for a later discussion, for another discussion. I had problems with that. Okay, is there anybody who would like to ask a question before we move to this? Let's see what we got on the program. You see, my eyesight is not very good, so I have to use a tablet. And sometimes it slips out of my hand, but it's still, I have to put in a code word every time. Yeah, so we have a break. We can take a cup of tea, make a cup of tea, whatever, we can come back at 15:00. 15:00, we have a change of program. We got a switch. It is going to be not Heribert Hinzen, but Njoki Wayne, who's from Kenya, and we're going to connect with her. She's in Kenya right now. She's a professor at the University of Toronto at OISI, head of the department, actually, of the human sciences department. I get confused with the names of the departments. And then afterwards, we'll have Heribert, because Yusuf Kassam could not make it. So we're filling in that slot. So Njoki Wayne goes first about Afrocentrism and Nyerere's ideas. And then we'll have Heribert afterwards. Heribert, as who you probably know, had worked a lot in Tanzania, did his PhD there, working in adult education in Tanzania. Welcome to the second part, post-break. So Heribert, over to you. Heribert Hinzen.
Okay, now thank you so much, Peter and Joseph. I'm very happy to join this, let's call it the Nyerere festivity.
Let me just say
years
that you
is
are the
something.
former director of the German Deutsche Volksschule, whatever, DVV International.
Your German is getting better all the time, Peter.
Oh, 9.
So I will switch to looking at adult learning and education and how I understood Nyerere at the time when I was very early in my career and at the very end. And then I will be looking at some of the documents, the reports, the recommendations, which are now strongly moving in the education world. So what I actually do is I have a professional lens on adult learning and education. I have an institutional lens on. You mentioned DVV International. We should also mention the International Council for Adult Education.
Yeah.
And of course, I have a personal lens on, as that is my understanding that maybe I have not been influenced more by anyone else than by the writings and everything from Nyerere. So let me start. And let me start with 3 quotations which Nyerere wrote or spoke. And the first one is the importance of adult education, both for our country and for every individual, cannot be overemphasized. Second, education is something that all of us should continue to acquire from the time we are born until the time we die. All this means that adult education has to be given priority within the overall development and recurrent revenue allocations of governments or other institutions. So these 3 quotations, I think, were important throughout my life. Let me give you a few biographical reflections on my early professional years. Actually, I started studying in Bonn in the 60s. In 1972, I participated in the University of Cologne in some seminars, and one was on Nyerere and Ujamaa in Tanzania. And another one was on Kaunda and humanism in Zambia. And I was happy to hear Catherine earlier, how she was even adding Obote and others at that time who were so strong in the development of their countries in the 60s and 70s. I moved on and started my dissertation at the University of Heidelberg. So I got a doctorate and looking with my dissertation into adult education and development in Tanzania, so with a comparative approach. And I was lucky at the time that I could join the Institute of Adult Education in Dar es Salaam as a research associate looking into the evaluation of Chaka Niuhai. And that followed on another radio mass campaign. I'm certain that Bud Hall will later talk about it because he was so deeply involved in the development of the mass campaigns in the Institute from 97 onwards, especially the Man is Health campaign, Mtuniafia. At the same time, I traveled from Dar es Salaam to Kenya and took part in a UNESCO seminar on comparative structures of adult education, where I first met Bud and Roby and quite a good number of the other important colleagues at the time in the field of adult education. It was actually the time that in 1976, I was invited by the UNESCO Institute of Lifelong, at that time, the Institute of Education in Hamburg, now the Institute of Lifelong Learning. And we started to coordinate a study on the developments in Tanzania, which the Hamburg Institute wanted to include into a series which they were publishing on the development of educational reforms actually globally. So we did the study on Tanzania, and if you look at the names, then you'll see that quite a number of those present today were authors of the study at the time. I joined DVV International, and in '78, I was a coordinator of projects in Africa, including Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, Somalia, and Zambia. And at the same time, I became editor of the journal Adult Education and Development. And again, you see all the names there who were authors at the time, and the journal was in existence for around 40 years. So the issue of 67 carries some of the discussions on Nyerere. If I look at what I'm doing currently, then I want to mention that I was deeply involved 2019 in a double anniversary. We were celebrating 100 years of the folk high schools in Germany. And the important step which our forefathers reached, they established an article in the constitution of the first democracy in Germany in 1919, the Weimar Republic. So actually, ever since, adult learning and education, and they even mentioned the folk high schools, are a matter, a constitutional matter. In the same year, we celebrated 50 years of DVV International. And actually, it is 50 years that we are celebrating now of the engagement of DVV, the folk high schools, today DVV International, in Tanzania. So I was invited 2019 to join a team to do a feasibility study for DVV International to establish a regional office for East Africa in Dar es Salaam. And in 2021, I did a keynote on the 50 years celebration of adult education in Tanzania at the University of Dar es Salaam. And you see a link, a new book on adult education in Tanzania has been published. At the same time, I got engaged in Confintea, the World Conference of UNESCO through PIMA. We did a special issue of the bulletin. Again, the link is there, and I will return back to Confintea later. There are 5 major writings by Nyerere. The Education for Self-Reliance was already mentioned. There was one which was later combined as Education Never Ends. So the New Year Eve speeches, which Nyerere did in 69 and 70. The same year, 70, when the University of Dar es Salaam was opened, he did the speech on the inauguration day. In 1974, he was giving an opening at an international seminar, calling it "Our Education Must Be for Liberation." And of course, the most famous Adult Education and Development, the address to ICAE conference in Dar es Salaam. And again, I assume Bud will later talk about more in depth about it. So actually, it is my understanding that Nyerere, with Education Never Ends, influenced the understanding of lifelong learning and its concepts, policy, and practice. And we can see that in Confintea 3, the UNESCO World Conference, which was then in Tokyo, 72. In the first of the UNESCO reports on the future of education, again, 72. The founding of the International Council for Adult Education, ICAE, 73. And he became the honorary president, not only of the conference, but of ICAE in 1976. So it is my understanding also that Nyerere, with his writing on adult education and development, influenced us heavily on organization and strategies in adult education. Let me mention a bit more about the emergence of ICAE. It was in 1972, during Confintea 3 in Tokyo, that informal meetings took place where Paul Maiki of Tanzania, earlier the Institute of Adult Education and the Kuvukoni College, Roby Kidd from the Canadian Association, Helmut Dolf from the German DVV, and Paul Bertelsen, actually from Denmark, who was at that time in UNESCO headquarters in Paris. So they had informal talks that a civil society organization in adult education would be needed to counteract what UNESCO is doing with all our governments. So it led to 1973, the founding of ICAE. So we are looking forward to celebrate 50 years anniversary in 2023. Actually, the first meeting of the ICAE Executive Council took place in the Cologne Folk High School, and ever since we are using the abbreviation VHS for Folk High School. As I said earlier, he became the first honorary president, later also Paulo Freire. Lalaji Baun, who died recently, wrote a report on the World Assembly for the ICAE journal Convergence, which appeared for some more than 40 years and then went into, how do we call that? The Dornröschenschlaf, that's the German word, a sleeping beauty for a decade. But fortunately, Peter, with his global chair, or his chair in global adult education, has started it again together with ICAE. And I enjoyed the session which he did in Marrakesh for the relaunch. I tried an article in the first issue after that decade, which is on convergence and ICAE in the context of Confintea and UNESCO, and you may want to have a look at it for some follow-up. Now let me turn to some of the UNESCO reports. We had 1973, the FAUR report, Learning to Be, looking at the world of education of today and tomorrow. And it came after those global reports by Philip Coombs on the world educational crisis. In Germany, we had Georg Picht, the Bildungskatastrophe. So it was something reforming that needed to be done. And I had always the feeling that some of the discussions which were there in Education for Self-Reliance and which were there in Education Never Ends somehow indirectly influenced the FAUR report. That was followed again through an international commission. FAUR at that time was the education minister in France. Delors at the time was the president of the European Union. they come up with a learning the treasure within. And just recently, there was the president of the Federal Republic of Ethiopia, Wolde Sevde, who finished on learning to become on the futures of education. And not surprisingly, all those reports have a lifelong learning perspective. Here again, the report has the link, and I really invite, it will be at least a guiding document for the next 2 decades. And I invite you also to read the document which was published by the UNESCO Institute, and of course, from civil society perspective, adult learning and education, because the future cannot wait. So it was, and again, in relationship to Nyerere being the president at the time, we had a situation that already in 94, we were invited to contribute to the 96 report by Delors. And this time again, 2020, ICAE leadership invited us to form a writers group, and we produced that document on adult learning and education, because the future cannot wait. Again, a very interesting document if you are interested in the civil society perspectives on adult education. I have 2 quotations here from that document, and that is on strengthening the institutional structures, like community learning centers. Earlier, Peter mentioned the folk development colleges in Tanzania, or I mentioned the folk high schools. All these are a certain sort of community learning centers for delivering ALE, and of course, securing the role of ALE staff. And the second point we raised is that improving in service and pre-service education, further education, training, capacity building, and the employment conditions of adult educators are a must. I go as far that we need policy, legislation, and financing for adult education in as much as we need it for the kindergarten, the school, the vocational, or the universities. Let me turn to global monitoring reports. Highly interesting to read and get an understanding how adult education developed throughout those decades ever since the World Education Forum in 2000. You can see some of those. You have all the link to the GEM report. The last one, which came out only this year, is that they stressed that NGOs, so the non-governmental sector, and the community organizations are the main providers in adult learning and education, and the non-state actors are a driving force in adult learning and education. So actually, we have an understanding that all what we are doing in civil society has now been recognized. And again, I link it very, very closely to the efforts of Nyerere starting in the 70s. Another report is GRAIL, the Global Report on Adult Learning and Education. We decided on that in the UNESCO Confinter 2009, and ever since there are 5 issues out. The link is there again, and you may want to look especially at the last one on active citizenship education, which is definitely very close to an understanding how adult learning and education can support democratic development. So all these conferences, reports, which I mentioned, are historical products of their time. And they all look at the diversity in both directions. It's on the one hand, knowledge, competencies, skills, and at the other hand, attitudes, behaviors, and values. So we're talking about a human right to education, a human right to adult learning and education in a perspective of lifelong learning. And again, my understanding, it is just like Nyerere did in his speeches and writings, in his engagement at his time. Let me turn to Confinter. Confinter is the French abbreviation Conférence Internationale sur l'Éducation des Adultes. So it's on the international conferences on the global level every 12 years. It's where government, civil society, and professional organizations meet. And the last one has just been in June 22 in Marrakesh. Previous one, 2009, in Belém in Brazil, made a strong statement that lifelong learning is from the cradle to grave. And it used all the words, the inclusive, the emancipatory, the humanistic, and democratic values. 2015, we had the Sustainable Development Goals, and there is a goal 4 among the 17. The abbreviation here is quality education. Actually, the overarching goal is expressed as ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. And we established a document of some 50 pages in the World Education Forum, which we had in Incheon in Korea. And it may still be interesting to look at, as from these two outcome documents from Belém and from the SDG, the recommendation on adult learning and education, RAIL, was adopted by the UNESCO General Conference. And actually, it is a revision of the 1976 document. As this has been adopted at the UNESCO General Conference, we should be clear that this is a normative document adopted by our governments, and sometimes we have to remind our governments what they actually adopted already through international cooperation. Community learning centers, again, like the folk development colleges, the folk high schools in Japan, it's the Kominkan. In Korea are the lifelong learning centers. So the institutional backing somehow is supported, and it should be supported through policy legislation and financing in all countries. ICAE contributed through a civil society meeting just a day before Marrakesh started. There's a good report on that, a document on the ICAE website. But at the same time, in preparation, a spotlight report on the different ICAE regions were prepared. Again, it may be interesting for you to have a look at it, what and how adult learning developed in your regions. The Marrakesh Framework for Action is a guiding document, at least for the next 25 years. So I invite you to have a look at it closer. And here I quote only that one where they are again arguing that strengthening ALE at the local level as a strategic dimension for planning, design, and implementation for learning programs, and for supporting and co-funding training and learning initiatives, such as community learning centers, to be well resourced with qualified adult educators. I'm now coming closer to the end, but I would like to let you know that ICAE is currently starting a 5-year campaign together with partners globally. They call it We Are ALE. There is a system of a diversity of curricula developed. This one here, the Curriculum Globale on the training of adult educators, has 6 very, very interesting modules, which may be even used on the university level. And this version is now adopted by the UNESCO Institute as something which should be used globally, but it was developed originally by DVV, the German Institute for Adult Learning and Research, and ICAE. But now it's on the market globally, supported by UNESCO. There are other curricula like the Curriculum Institutionale, how to develop organizations, how to train managers, how to work on intercultural adult learning and education, and even an interesting adult learning and education system building approach, which was developed especially in Ethiopia and Uganda is there. So all that can be taken from the adult learning and education toolbox. So what I tried to do was I wanted to look at you at a human right to lifelong learning, which from my understanding is close to Nyerere's thinking, with a strong emphasis on adults as the largest group in society, the longest time in life, and therefore adult learning and education is important for each individual and society. Concluding with proverbs and slogans on adult education and lifelong learning, we were happy to receive Education Never Ends by Nyerere. The European Union uses in their commission in 2006, it is never too late to learn. When I was working in Moldova recently, they called it one learns all life and is still ignorant. We have one in Germany, learning from the cradle to the grave, von der Wiege bis zur Bahre. And when I was working those 5 years in Sierra Leone in West Africa, the Mende ethnic group had even a very stronger one, where they argue learning starts in the womb and ends in the tomb. So already during pregnancy, learning is starting. A final note, we worked strongly to get Julius Nyerere and Paulo Freire as posthumous honors in the International Adult Education and Continuing Education Hall of Fame. And we succeeded in 2008, and that is where they are supposed to stay. So thank you so much, Asante Sana, and I will be happy to discuss further and listen to the other presentations coming.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm unmuted. Thank you, Herbert. Very interesting. It's never too late to learn, actually, was an Italian expression by Alberto Manzi. It was a TV program, you probably know about this, Non è mai troppo tardi. And then the European Union took it. Very original. But anyway, yeah.
But Peter, do you know the process? The process was that in the year 2000, there was a memorandum on lifelong learning by the European Commission. Yeah, we did a study at that time with the European Association, which was on trends and issues in adult learning and education. And then they used this, it is never too late to learn, in 2006. And in the action plan in 2007, they were using, it is always a good time to learn. I think...
Listen, I mean, these ideas, they percolate, and of course, it's good that people keep revising them and coming back to them. Anyway, we'll have a discussion after Njoki's presentation. I believe Njoki is present now, and she is being ready. Njoki, we waited for you, but then, you know, like, once we didn't hear, we moved over to Heribert. So Njoki, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much. Can I be able to share the screen, please?
Yeah.
Can I be enabled to share the screen?
Yeah. Joe, can you help share screen? Joe.
Yes, he has shared.
Okay,
Yeah.
He's got to share, because I don't know if I can do that. I have to share here as well. Okay.
I just need to.
Professor at the what's the department called these days? Our department used to be sociology and education. Now it's called
Social Justice Education.
Oh, okay. And that she's the head of that department. You know, like I knew in Njoki were both students, grad students at OISI many, many moons ago.
Okay, thank you, Peter, for the introduction and also for inviting me to participate in thinking about or remembering Nyerere, and especially if he was with us today, he would have turned 100 years. And thinking about Nyerere, Nyerere was one of the people who are very active in terms of anti-colonial thought. In addition to being a politician, he was a nationalist. He had, he started decolonizing way before we, you know, the academy talked about decolonization. So today I want to start by giving some quotes from Nyerere in honor of him. If real development is to take place, the people have to be involved. That was Nyerere's ideology. He also said a man or a woman, I had to earn there the gender equity, is developing himself or herself when he, she grows or earns enough to provide decent conditions for himself or herself and their family. He is not being developed if someone gives him or her these things. So when we get handouts, it's not development for us, and Nyerere was very opposed to that. It's better to struggle, and when you struggle, you appreciate what you have struggled for. So thinking about my presentation today, I wanted to evoke the notion of self-reliance as a philosophy. And the way I thought of self-reliance as a philosophy is by centering African indigenous ways of knowing. And the question I'm asking, how do we do that? How do we do that? Again, using a proverb from Rwanda, says if you are building a house and a nail breaks, you stop building or do you change the nail? And I'll say we change the nail because that's what Nyerere wanted us to do. If his initial efforts did not seem to have taken root, which I believe they did, it doesn't mean that we threw the baby with the bathwater. No. Some questions to keep in mind as we have this conversation is how do we engage with topics of self-reliance from an Afrocentric perspective, from a place of sincerity, honesty, and openness. I think many times when we talk about self-reliance, we might get carried away in terms of, let me make as much money as I can using capitalist ways of knowing, and I'll be self-reliant. But that was not what Nyerere advocated. Because when you do that, when you amass a lot of wealth without thinking about others, I don't think you are coming from a place of sincerity, honesty, and openness. And that's why I pose this question in terms of how do we talk about self-reliance from Nyerere's point of view. And then the second question is, how can we make use of indigenous or decolonial, our culture, ways of teaching and learning to decolonize our minds, body, and spirit? Because Nyerere, at independence, Nyerere really wanted us to root our ways of knowing, to root ourselves, our development, our education in our culture, what was familiar to us. That's what he wanted. How can we do that? I know I do remember during one of the comments that Peter made, or the asked a question, how can you do that at this point, at this time, when there is so much that is happening, when there is so much changes that have occurred? And then the third question that I would like us to think about is, if Nyerere physically were to be present, what would he tell us as he assesses what has taken place in terms of self-reliance? The previous speaker, Haldat, gave us a lot of documents and ways that Nyerere's work has been taken up. I wonder what will be his comment in terms of how the world has received and advocated for what Nyerere thought about or cared for. In order to bring some sensibility to Nyerere's work, because it's very broad when we are talking about self-reliance, I thought I'll use 3 C's: community, commitment, and collaboration. Nyerere advocated for community, from local community to international community. He did not want to isolate Tanzania at all, but he wanted us to root everything that we did from the local and then go global.
And then commitment for self-development, commitment for development of the community, commitment to be in touch with what is happening in the world. If you're developing an education, we develop an education that speaks to the Tanzanian, that speaks to the African people, and that translates to the global community. Collaboration. He advocated and, Ujamaa villages and all kinds of ways of collaborating locally as well as internationally. So those are the 3 C's I would like to focus in terms of looking at self-reliance, a philosophy that Nyerere advocated and really cared for. When we are talking about community, we are not just talking about one singularity of members of a community. We are talking about scholars, activists, politicians, anti-colonial theorists, nationalists, farmers, homemakers, and Nyerere advocated for all these. And as Edward stated in 1993, we are never one thing, that no one is one thing. No one is ever simply 2 or 3 things either. Our identities are complex and in some ways fluid. So we can be scholars, activists, politicians, anti-colonial theorists, nationalists, and so on and so forth. And that's what Nyerere advocated for. You can participate from whatever location that you are able to locate yourself in this discussion. In order for us to talk about commitment to Mwalimu's philosophy of self-reliance, the presentations that were there before mine indicated that his work is taking place. And I'm just giving a suggestion is, let's revisit our vision and create a roadmap using self-reliance as one aspect of Nyerere's work, his philosophy on self-reliance. Let's revisit our vision. Let's revisit the vision that Nyerere had when Tanzania got its independence, high independence, because he was advocating a vision for self-reliance, not only for Tanzania, but for the whole of Africa. And then once we have revisited our vision that we had at the, at independence, let's create a roadmap and let's populate that roadmap with the African-centered teachings and lessons. And in other words, what I'm advocating here is the importance of recentering ourselves. Because if we are not centered, someone else will center us. We'll be operating from the margin. And if you're operating from the margin, how can we survive? Unless we create a center in the margin. And that's why I'm saying revisiting, coming up with a vision, and let's populate it with African indigenous ways of knowing, because those will be the cement, the concrete that will hold us together. Commitment. It's very, very important to commit, to have a commitment to the self. Because if I'm not committed to myself, if I'm not liberated mentally, physically, and so on and so forth, how can I join the collective? I need to have a clear mind to join the collective. So where are we on the world map on African indigenous ways of knowing? And where are we on the world map when we are talking about African indigenous of knowing using self-reliance? Where are we on the world map on African indigenous ways of knowing, looking at our education? Is our education reflective of African indigenous ways of knowing? So how do we have a commitment to educating the young people, to educating adults, lifelong learners, ensuring that whatever we are centering that education has semblance of African indigenous ways of knowing, has semblance of African indigenous education. I don't have time to go into details about, what are the tenets of African indigenous education or African indigenous ways of knowing, but self-reliance was one of the pillars of African indigenous ways of knowing or African indigenous education. The beauty about all this is that Mwalimu left us with the strategies to reclaim our center. So the question is, how do we do that? We can do it by taking block by block, by looking at what fits and what doesn't fit, we knock it off. because what doesn't fit might not be relevant today. Mwalimu did not advocate for us being static. Everything has to change according to the way things are going, and what is not relevant for us, we knock it off and we move on. And so I'm going back to some of foundational thoughts of Mwalimu Nyerere, and what I did, I selected Afrocentricity, anti-colonial thought, decolonial systems thought. Afrocentricity, all that I'm advocating is let's center the African in everything we do. If you're looking at education, how does that education speak to the African? How can we put the African at the center? If you are talking about economics, how do we put African at the center of economies, so that we're not dependent? We are not dependent from outsiders. If you are thinking about, for instance, there has been a lot of drought. How can we use African resources to create irrigation, to create dams, to grow our food, instead of depending? Right now, we have a conversation in Kenya about GMOs. That is what the government has agreed to bring into Kenya. GMOs is not African-centered. It doesn't speak to our needs. So if we are to revisit, to revision what we need, we didn't have to pay African-centered ways of knowing African needs, but not to borrow ideas from outside. Anti-colonial thought, we are just, stepping into the path that Mwalimu started for us, being action-oriented. Anti-colonial thought is action-oriented. We don't just theorize. We theorize and we put it into action, just like the way it has been shown by the previous speaker in terms of the journals that have been published. Decolonial systems of thought, again, Afrocentricity, anti-colonial thought, decolonial systems of thought, these are whole lessons. So I cannot just do justice by talking for half an hour. Decolonial systems of thought is revisiting the past. Sankofa is a Ghanaian philosophy, saying let's look back and check what is in the golden egg and take what we need in order to have a decolonial systems of thought. And decolonial systems of thought is saying, let's start with the culture that speaks to us. And when I talk about the culture that speaks to the people of African descent, it doesn't mean that putting back what is not relevant to us. It's taking what is relevant and putting it into practice and putting it into meaning, providing meaningful thought into that. But of course, when we are thinking about all this, Afrocentricity, decolonization, decolonial, there is a lot of resistance. So how do we deal with the resistance? Resistance to African-centered ways of knowing. We do know, even our young generation, when you tell them anything about African, they say, oh, wow, that's of the past. We don't need that. We are modern. What does modernity mean? How can you not put modernity within the African-centered thought? So how do we deal with the resistance? Again, Peter, you might have to come up with a topic where we are talking of how to deal with the resistance based on what Nyerere left for us. How do we embrace Nyerere in totality? We'll try and break the chains. It will not be easy. I have some few suggestions in terms of creating Afrocentric policies and programs that will speak to our educational system, that will speak to the development, that will speak to the needs of the people of African ancestry. One is creating policies and pedagogies that are institutionally supported and implemented. We can talk about what is ideal, but if those policies and programs are not supported by our educational institutions, by our economic institutions, by our government, we'll be doing nothing. So we'll need to make sure that we do the campaigning and we get support. Mwalimu Nyerere, when he was alive, he was a center. He supported African ways of knowing. He supported that. We need to work towards our politicians to ensure that our programs that speak to us are supported and implemented. And then another point is by creating pedagogies that recognize self-reliance to allow spaces for sharing multiple voices and perspectives, so that it's not one voice. We get voices from different angles. We get voices from adults, we get voices from young people, we get voices from, from the elders, we get voices from outside. And then we start creating approaches, pedagogical approaches that will enable us to have self-reliance. We have to stop depending from the outside. Mwalimu Nyerere was so adamant in making us being self-reliant in food, in everything. We have to go back to the source. We have to go back to the drawing board. And then by linking theoretical content of learning to African indigenous ways of knowing, storytelling. When you tell a story, you never forget. Because after telling a story, you ask the children, what lessons did you learn? What was the theme in the stories that you learned? If we can bring that, I know some schools in Africa are doing that. We need to ensure that every classroom, storytelling is part and parcel of our educational system. Creation stories, we only have one particular creation story. In one of the books that I've written, I've talked about different creation stories in Africa. And each of the creation stories in Africa had a meaning. And they indicated where we are from. And they indicated the essence of, the human and the spirit, and how we cannot disconnect the humans from the spirit and the centrality of that. We have seen in the last presentation the use of proverbs. Let's use proverbs in our teaching. I know some schools are doing that. Let's emphasize that. Myths, wise saying, because once we do that, learning becomes more meaningful, learning becomes more enjoyable, and we start promoting positive growth. We start promoting positive development, and our young people as well as adults start experiencing life differently and meaningfully. The fourth one I suggested is by employing a collaborative global approach, because we are not an island. We have to ensure that we have collaborators from outside. We have to join hands and see how we can be able to achieve this, that we are proposing, an African-centered approach. We cannot do it alone. We have to hold the globe together in order to be successful. And the fifth one is having a commitment to unpack educational systems. We do know that, especially I'm talking about the educational system we have in Africa and in Kenya in particular, doesn't speak to our needs. That's why we have high unemployment. We need to think outside the box. And the only way we can think outside the box is by unpacking the educational system without politicians feeling that they are being attacked. We need to have an honest conversation. In conclusion, is that let's remember the 3 C's: community, commitment, and collaboration. Local community to global community to international community. Commitment to the self, to the local, to the global. And collaboration, we cannot do it alone. And today, Peter, what you have actually demonstrated today is bringing people from across the world. We have scholars from, from Canada, from Brazil, from Germany, from Europe, and from different countries of Africa. You have brought a global community to show collaboration in terms of commitment to Nyerere's ideals of self-reliance. To be self-reliant doesn't mean that we throw out other people, we bring them together, because we are all implicated in making ourselves and community better. If I have a house and my neighbors don't have a house, that's not being a community-oriented person. That's not being committed to the community. And our commitment to revisit Mwalimu's philosophies and engage in difficult conversation on African indigenous knowledges in our schools. I mean, some people say, oh, you know, Mwalimu Nyerere's philosophies did not materialize. We did not have enough books written in Swahili. We did not have this. If there was commitment when Mwalimu suggested and came up with that philosophy on Jamaa villages, do you know how far we will be today? We would have, I can't even imagine where we'll be today in Africa. Look at, I always say when you look at Tanzania and Kenya, the nationalism that Nyerere cemented among Tanzanians is very, very, very different from the nationalism commitment of the Kenyans. And many times we are referred to, the Kenyans are referred to as man eat man society. We are in too much competition to make money fast, to make money, you know, in different ways. And in conclusion, I'll leave you with one proverb. If your only tool is a hammer, you will see every problem as a nail. We do have different ways of looking at self-reliance and coming up with a solution to make our community, to make our local and global community better. Asante sana, thank you so much. Given an opportunity, I'll give a talk on each of the three C's. But for now, let's open for conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Njoki. That was quite uplifting. And it's interesting, I noticed indigenous spelled with a capital I. I know that is a big issue, especially in North America.
Yes.
Try to observe it in my writing. There's a whole politics behind that. I think that's something which is worth noting. But we'll come to the discussion afterwards. I don't want to I'll start hogging it. So we've had two presentations, one by Heribert, how Nyerere influenced different proclamations, communiques and organizations, including the International Council for Adult Education. It's a pity we haven't got a special issue dedicated to Nyerere right now, that we're just relaunching Convergence, because he should be there. And then we have about Afrocentric knowledge, which as Njoki rightly mentions, doesn't mean it is essentialist way of looking at African, because you have to ask the question, what is African? Handel Wright raises this. Is this an African I see before me? We tend to generalize and create stereotypes as a result. But if I was living in Africa, of course, the point of departure would be my part of Africa and the rest of Africa. But I like the idea of the planetary consciousness. I try to keep that as my guiding path in my own teaching and writing. And I've suffered for it, even by students, white students who use the language of the oppressed to, to assert themselves. But anyway, that's a long story. I wouldn't like to go into it. It's also very hurtful. However, I say my commitment is towards a planetary consciousness of subalternity. Now, we may look for a much better user-friendly word than the subaltern, because the subaltern also, it's based from military, and I know Gramsci promoted it. Gayatri Spivak made it more complex. She says that the working class, the industrial working class, is not subaltern because they are educated and they can read. Anyway, I don't want to go into that. But it can raise lots and lots of questions. I think we cannot be neutral. So we cannot say everybody has a right. No, some people are much more privileged than others. If they're going to unlearn their privilege, it's a big issue. And anyway, I don't want to take it further. Please come in, open your mics and intervene. There's much food for thought, much grist for the mill, as the English say. So.
Peter, if I can comment, I have a meeting starting in 3 minutes. After the meeting, I will join you. Hopefully the conference will still be on. But there is a lot of debate in terms of using I for indigenous and so on and so forth. And then because all that we are saying is, start with what is familiar to an African child. Start with what is familiar to an African adult. And let us use the I capital to show the importance of that. There are lots of debates among that. There are lots of debates in terms of scholars. The other thing we say is that everyone is indigenous to a place. So it's not that if you are of European descent, you don't have indigeneity. You do have indigeneity, and that's why we say going back to the source and bringing the threads together as a global community, and picking up what speaks to us and leaving the rest, what doesn't speak to us. You know, having that difficult conversation. And Catherine has written a book on African indigenous knowledges, and that's what I was saying.
Catherine Hoppers.
Yeah. Yes, Catherine Hopper has a book on African indigenous knowledges, a very, very good book that I would say, let's adopt that book in our schools and let's learn those philosophies from an early age. Let's invite elders to our classrooms to tell their stories, to give proverbs, to give interpretation to proverbs. And on that note, I have to rush to the other meeting.
Well, thanks for finding the time for being with us. And
okay, thank you.
Sharing your wisdom with us.
All right, bye.
Bye-bye. Ubuntu.
The book.
Anybody want to intervene?
Yes. Yeah. The book Joki referred to is called Indigenous Knowledge and the Integration of Knowledge Systems towards a Philosophy of Articulation. Towards a philosophy of articulation.
Oh, I just got a question now from somebody. What is the book of Catherine? You answered it right now, a message chat. Yeah,
I will write it.
It was a philosophy of articulation. Yes. I remember once looking at a book by Akimpelu. Do you know him, Joseph Akimpelu? A Philosophy of Education and African Perspective. That's interesting. I want to go back to it to see how much Mwalimu, this is the topic of today's session, is present in that book. But yes, anybody else would like to intervene? In our way at the University of Malta, we try to, some of us, not all, try to forward subaltern perspectives, including African perspectives. Okay, Latin America has been over. It has quite a following throughout the world, and even maybe more Asiatic. I know Iris pulled me up for that once. Literature, except from India. I think also Vandana Shiva has a lot of interesting things to say in relation to today's world. Okay, so you got the book title there. I'm sure we have it in our library. Okay. Are there any takers? Anybody who would like to come in? Any questions, statements, clarifications? Is there anybody who has the floor? I can't see. Are you noticing anybody who would? Iris, would you like to say something about Asian knowledge in this context? Yes. I know this is the bee in your bonnet. You would research on Asian, not just India, because I know India.
So I'm coming from Southeast Asia, so I do get the idea of so like I did ask about diversity of cultures earlier because that is something that is more prominent, I suppose, in like where I come from. especially in the Philippines, they come from an archipelago. So you would assume that every island would have like something different to offer. So like and similarly, like to Swahili, I suppose, the language that I use when I'm at home is Tagalog, because that is, which is the language of the capital. So like, and it is currently what is more or less equivalent to what we consider Filipinos, the Filipino language. So I was thinking about that, but the problem is that the thing with promoting a Tagalog Filipino is that certain knowledges also like are not written well enough because it is lost in translation. Like it's not, I mean, the indigenous language can't really be translated that well into the national language. Like I am curious about those types of knowledges that do come missing. But then again, sometimes there are also better ways of documenting things, which is like through recordings, videos, and sometimes even by asking the people themselves to do like the documentation. I don't know. So like, but yeah. So I do think that it's certain responding to diversity is also about responding in diverse ways of doing academic work. I guess because that is something that I sometimes see as effective.
Can I say something?
Okay.
You know, can I say, okay, you know, at that time, Nyerere's time,
As president.
Yes, people thought that higher education was, was pure, just go to school and, go through the hierarchies and so on and so forth. I tell you, as we went further and further, we found that higher education has a case to answer. Higher education and the academy in general, we found that it has a case to answer in terms of almost executing cultural violence. Galtung outlined 3 types of violence. Direct violence that kills quickly and its effects are measured in terms of body counts. And then structural violence, which kills slowly. And it is measured in terms of how systems are structured in such a way that you can be impoverished for generations while others are okay, while you are being thought of as primitive, as nonsense and so on. So that is how Africans have been viewed. And the international agencies saw the developing countries like nails, really, like nonsense. We have to educate them into our ways.
Missionary.
Yes, this is the trap that the initial phases of adult education fell into. That is why literacy was such a contested terrain, because in the early conferences, literacy was equated like to save people and to liberate people, and yet the founders of literacy didn't know that oracy is a much more distinct and attribute that the developing countries already had. So all the influence, even UNESCO, let us go and save them. They are primitive, and so on and so forth. And that is where adult education lost its ethics. You get me? So to add on to what Joki was saying, we have to operationalize inclusivity in such a way that we recognize everybody's indigeneity first.
Yes.
And then we'll hold hands together. And then we'll say, okay, where do you come from? What is your proverb? What is it that you want us to share? I will ask you as a person coming from Malta, tell me about your proverbs, for example. So we can hug each other as indigenous people. Yes. Thank you.
This reminds me of a very important aspect, which not shocked me, amused me, but is so significant. About Tanzania, I think Bud Hall told me this some years ago. Correct me if I'm wrong, Bud. But I've checked it out with my anthropologists in Malta who have worked in Africa. Nyerere, when they opened up the University of Dar es Salaam, before that was University of East Africa Regional, which had also your university in Uganda, Catherine. They opened up very different from what Malta did. Many subjects, sociology, literature. I mean, Nyerere himself was enamored of English literature. He translated 2 works by Shakespeare into Kiswahili, except anthropology. Because anthropology, actually, in its worst missionary sense, I know there are people who would differ. They're much more critical anthropologists in that respect. But by and large, seems to be very colonial. They go and study the African. I want to live like the African, to create a technology of power. And I believe it was not accepted at the University of Dar es Salaam as a subject. I probably told you this, Iris, in our classes. Sort of, how certain subjects, the way they get promoted. I'm not trying to generalize here about all anthropology, because there are people very aware of it. 2 of my colleagues, one of them passed away, Paul Cloud, who did work in Nigeria, was very conscious of this. And he said this, of course. He said, we are, the subject is regarded with suspicion, putting it mildly, in African universities because of the way Africans have been treated. So this is very interesting, even the kind of knowledge we teach, not only going into the depth of that knowledge, but even certain subjects and how that gets promoted is up for contention, also from a much more, if you want to call it Afrocentric or subaltern perspective. Anyway, I wonder if anybody wants to comment on this, or otherwise we'll move towards Bud and his presentation. So, does anybody want to say something about this? Bud, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you. It was a nice segue, Peter, and that's true. What you said is that anthropology was not accepted, was not included among the founding disciplines at the University of Dar es Salaam because of the colonial nature. Anthropology was the discipline which allowed both all of the empires to control people. They needed to understand Africans and Asians and others, but they didn't want them to have any agency or to be involved in a democratic process. So they created this field called anthropology, where people would go in, white people would go in and live and study and try to understand what was going on in those communities, and then be able to become experts and inform the colonial offices on what life was like, in order to be able to strengthen the controls, the colonial controls over those countries. First of all, Peter, thank you very much for, and Joseph, your technical assistant, for pulling this together. I think that as we've been hearing from everybody, the vision, the importance, the impact of Nyerere's thinking, I think has been to some degree underrepresented or underappreciated. Those of us who are here today, can attest to the impact, but I think in some other ways, in the broader intellectual community, Nyerere's kind of intellectual contributions have not been as widely known as they might have been. So your effort to create this centenary conversation is so much appreciated. And I also want to thank you deeply personally for bringing Convergence back to life, because Convergence was the journal where a lot of, in fact, Nyerere himself had an article published in Convergence. I think that was in '69. I think Education for Self-Reliance was published in Convergence with an introduction by the first principal of the University of Dar es Salaam, who was a Canadian by the name of Cranford Pratt. So thank you very much, Peter, for that. And I look forward, I think, in terms of future festivals, I don't think we need to wait till everybody dies. We have 3 women on this call today who we could have, we could celebrate. And there's probably more, but there's Marjorie Mbellini. There's Catherine Dora Hoppers, and there's Njoki Wani. And each of these people have made extraordinary contributions, and the depth of their contributions is not well enough known. And I highly recommend, let's not wait for 100 years, because all of us will be dead, and it won't. Even you, Peter, you'll all be dead. So.
Oh, I'm 67. I'm getting there.
Yeah, but in 100 years,
it's not.
In 100 years, you won't be here. So let me begin by introducing and telling you a bit about myself. I am a settler Canadian, and my family bought land very cheaply from a company that had taken land from the Halalt First Nation, an indigenous First Nations community on Vancouver Island in the late 1870s. by becoming landowners, my family became middle class. They were landless, wandering the world looking for some place to live. And because they got land, all of my great aunts and uncles were able to get good educations, and they took up leader positions in the colonial settler society. And I am, in fact, here today on this Zoom conversation because of the privilege which I gained because my family took land, dispossessed the land of indigenous people on this island. I currently live as an uninvited guest on a location called Megan. Megan, this is a part of the Lekwungen speaking territory in the city known by its colonial name, Victoria, on Vancouver Island, which is on the west in the Pacific Ocean off the west coast of Canada. I'm a professor emeritus at the University of Victoria, and I also, I'm a co-chair. I'm not a chair, I'm a co-chair. I'm only half a chair. Peter's a full chair. I'm a half chair of the UNESCO Chair in Community-Based Research and Social Responsibility. I think others have said, Catherine, and I think Herbert have indicated the influence of Mwalimu Nyerere on themselves, and I would echo that. I think that Mwalimu Nyerere has had more influence on my thinking about education, about African resurgence, and about knowledge democracy than any other single person. And I think that this is for several reasons. One is the age at which I was introduced to his thinking. I was, in my early 20s and had the opportunity to live and work in Tanzania for a number of years, and came into contact with so many interesting, people. A second.
Yes.
Yeah, just a second. I heard somebody throw
No.
in my house.
Okay.
Yeah. Just a second. Sorry, there was somebody else. So I spent a number of years in Tanzania at the Institute of Adult Education, and Herbert, mentioned I was involved in, I was the first research officer at the Institute and involved in a lot of the early evaluation work. In addition, when I left Tanzania, I joined the International Council for Adult Education, which Paulo Mhaiki, who had been my boss in Tanzania, was a co-founder. And it was because of him that I got a job at the International Council for Adult Education, which Roby Kidd had established in Tanzania. And I was fortunate to have been the secretary of the conference in 1976, where Mwalimu Nyerere gave the keynote address, and Paulo Freire was there, and so many interesting people. But I want to begin with a story about the extent of Mwalimu Nyerere's influence and interest in global development. My conversation, my contribution today is to talk about kind of the global legacy of Nyerere. I really enjoyed hearing everybody who Anna Grace and Ahmed Kipacha and Njoki and others and Herbert's masterful rendering of the adult education policy world of the last 50 years. Really impressive. I've enjoyed that very much. My contribution will be a little bit different. And I want to begin with a story that I'm telling that I got from a woman called Lorna Williams, Lorna Wanotsa Williams, who's a Lillooet elder and she's a scholar of indigenous languages and learning, and a professor emeritus at the University of Victoria. And we have a lot of things in common. And one of the things that surprised me a lot was she told me about the interest of Mwalimu in the Lillooet indigenous-led school that they created in the 1970s. Now, Lillooet, the school they created is in the mountains on the coast of British Columbia. Most people don't even know it exists. But in the 1970s, Lorna and others in their community created a school, a Lillooet-led, Lillooet knowledge-based school. So here's the story that I'm sharing from Lorna. She says, one day we got a message that a Tanzanian was being sent by Mwalimu Nyerere all the way from East Africa to visit our new Lillooet school, which we had just created in our First Nations community in the coastal range of mountains of the west coast of what is today called British Columbia on the west coast of Canada. It seems that Mwalimu felt that we were putting into place many of the principles that he had spoken about in his Education for Self-Reliance policy document. I remember how important it was to have these visits because what we were doing was so far from what education was at the time. And thanks to the dreaming of possibilities and the listening to the people by members of our community, we were designing an education that respected our Lillooet world and way of educating, and also addressing the damage caused by colonial practices like the residential schools. And those visits, letting us know people out there were paying attention, gave us more courage to continue on our track. Restoring our languages, knowing our history, understanding colonialism and imperialism and its impacts, reconnecting with our lands and ancestors, families and communities, and figuring out the people who settled our lands. At the time, we were not so clear that we shared so much with so many around the world. And that is why his visit, why this visit, letting us know what was happening in Africa, was so important. She goes on to say, I know that the indigenous rights leader, George Manuel, had been in touch with indigenous people in many parts of the world. And I believe that he had visited Tanzania and met Mwalimu. And I guess that is how they came to know about us. So I share that story because for a global community, the ideas that Nyerere was bringing forth within the context of his vision of what Tanzania could be had rippled across the world. So you have to imagine that here is Nyerere, who was a product of the independence movement, influenced by many of the African intellectuals, the Nkrumahs of the day, the great kind of anti-colonial thinkers, the Gandhijis and so forth of the world, bringing that that kind of awareness about the power of liberation to a vision of a nation that he had a leadership opportunity to become involved in as the leader of the independence movement. And in so doing, he was able to articulate at the time it's hard we hear about all of his influence, and some of it sounds quite status quo or quite institutional. His influence, his vision, was a very radical vision at the time, a very radical vision. The idea that you could have an Afrocentric perspective on education was was totally radical. Africa was being told, and many Africans believed and still believe that, the Western way, modernity, Western knowledge, English, all of that was the way, that's progress, that's the way for the future. And Nyerere said no. He said that, he always said that poor people don't use money for a weapon, and people rely on people's knowledge and leadership to transform the world. So there's a lot has been written about, and Herbert's got a book, I have a book. There's a lot of wonderful books written about, what went on in those early years in Tanzania. And I don't, and we're going to have Marjorie, who is, just extraordinarily, we're so gifted, so lucky to have Marjorie on this line, who actually knew Nyerere personally, and probably put his ideas more powerfully into action than he might have even imagined himself. I'm looking forward to hearing from Marjorie. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the outcomes and some of the ways in which these ideas have been taken up. So my role in Tanzania was as a researcher. I was hired to be a research officer, to work with the Institute of Adult Education, in evaluations, teaching research, and so forth. And I found myself, as Marjorie did, and as Yusuf Kasam did, and as Kemal Mustafa did, and Anakleti, a number of us who had been trained in, kind of standard research methods, the usual sort of survey research methodology. I found myself, in a very uncomfortable position, because the way I had taught to create good research and good knowledge was actually in contradiction to Nyerere's philosophy. He talked about building on people's knowledge. He talked about, participation. He talked about, village-based development. And I was trained that I should read all of the people who've written about a certain subject, and that would be my literature review. And of course, all of the people that meant almost always British or European or North Americans who'd had the money and the access to write all of that stuff. And then I would dream up some research questions, and then I would somehow, get some people to answer the questions. And then I would, using the knowledge I had in my head, I would analyze the data and come up with a research report. Well, this over a period of a number of years, in conversations, lots of conversations with Marjorie and others, this idea of what we called originally participatory research, and Anna Grace and Marjorie and Richard and Bala have got a Swahili term that they translate as animation for this process. We felt that there was a better way, that knowledge creation itself could be a transformative, an empowering, a liberating, process, but not if it was done the way that, Western-oriented research methods had been developed. There had to be a different approach. And so when I left, just another short anecdote. I still remember I was actually in Marjorie Imbellini's house, and she showed me this red book, and she said, there's this guy from Brazil. She says, you've got to read this book. It's called Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And I said, who is he? She said, his name is Paulo Freire. And Marjorie was the first person I knew who had heard about him. And this was, I guess, in 1970 or 71. Later on, he came to Tanzania. And yeah, as I wrote in I wrote several places about I was fortunate to be, to go with Paulo to meet with Mwalimu Nyerere the first time they met. Paul Mhaiki, my boss, and asked me to come along with. I was taking Paulo around for one of his visits in Tanzania, and I'm not going to go into that story. That's another story which you can read about. But I want to continue with this idea of of new ways of thinking about knowledge and how Nyerere's vision, his idea about whose knowledge counted and where knowledge, the source of knowledge, how powerful an idea and how radical an idea that was. And it's that nugget of an idea is something that is carried on. So when I left Tanzania, I found out about people working in India. I found out about Orlando Falls Borda. I learned a lot more about the work of Freire and other Brazilians, and I found even in England working class activists working in different ways, and so the idea of creating a participatory research network got started in the 70s. And what's interesting is that I went on to do all kinds of other things in between, but I'm working now, and I'm working very closely with Catherine and Kipacha and the colleagues in Arusha, and Marjorie has been involved in our network, our Knowledge for Change network. There is a movement, a knowledge movement, a knowledge democracy, or an epistemic justice movement, which is moving all through higher education circles, all through the circles of knowledge workers, and we have it in Canada. It's going on all over the place, and I trace for me, I trace the inspiration, for that kind of thinking back to Nyerere's, his ability to articulate and to speak in a language, an accessible language, which so many of us were able to grasp onto. And we've all taken, we talk about now, talking about decolonizing education, and some people think, well, that term just came up in South Africa a few years ago, but Nyerere had a concept in Swahili. We used to say the word kasumba, which kasumba means colonial ways of thinking. And Nyerere's first principle of adult education was to create awareness that change is possible, and to liberate oneself from these colonial ways of thinking. And that was back in, that was in his in the Elimu Haina Mwisho speech in 1970. Long before a lot of the other people, the more contemporary authors are coming, have sort of got onto this idea of decolonization. But what's exciting about and I really like Catherine, thank you very much for your comment about the about the confusion around or the misplaced idealism around higher education, as it emerged in the 60s and 70s, where there really was a belief that all you have to do is to get this kind of European style education and everything would be fine. But what the world now knows is that even for European countries, North American countries, European countries, the so-called Eurocentric, body of knowledge, is not working. Why do we have the mess that we're in with, climate crisis and so forth? We are learning that the not only is the Eurocentric body of knowledge not good for other parts of the world, it's not even good for Europe and North America, and scholars and activists and policy people are struggling to try and imagine a new what kind of higher education might there be if we were really willing to engage with a multiplicity of epistemologies, a multiplicity of ways of knowledge. We have to take and that movement around epistemic justice, that movement around decolonization of higher education, you can trace it in right back to the early vision. So I'm sure that if Mwalimu were alive today, he would be he'd be in workshops and seminars with Catherine and Marjorie and Joki and Paul Wangula and these people. He'd be there. He'd be supporting them. He'd be probably making notes and so forth. And because his ideas, he was somebody. He learned. He was a powerful learner. He learned, he learned from the colonial experience. He learned from, the books and the stories of other people. And as he went along throughout his life, he changed his mind. He grew. He re-articulated. And I'm thoroughly convinced that if he were alive today, he would be, he would still be, a global leader, in the fight for, a new way of understanding and living, of understanding knowledge, as a liberating and a transformative power for change. So thank you very much, and I very much look forward to hearing from my great friend Marjorie Beligi.
So that's an introduction to you, Marjorie. The screen is yours. But you could lower, if you have a laptop, lower this so that we can see you perfectly. We only have your mouth covered. And this is all you have to do is you've got a laptop. Just, brilliant.
Okay.
Yeah. There's the man. Okay. Marjorie, unmute yourself.
I'm gonna try to share a PowerPoint, and as everybody knows, I'm not sure how to do this.
Joseph.
So I'm gonna hit the share button.
Yeah. Joseph, we need your help.
Yeah, I see my own. Do you see it now?
Not yet, but something's coming up. Yes, we do.
You can see it. Okay.
Yeah,
So
liberating.
can I begin by thanking the organizers of this meeting for inviting me to participate, and all the previous speakers, and especially now Bud Hall, and before that Anna Grace. And I would also like to emphasize right now, for those who don't know, and that Richard Mabala is one of our foremost gurus, practitioners of participatory research, animation, Arabic, and Anna Grace works closely with him, as well as many other people. And maybe a short personal introduction, because I didn't put that much in, I didn't put anything. I was born in the US, became a citizen of Tanzania in 1967, which, as you know, was a wonderful year. It was a joyous year in Tanzania, a joyous time of optimism, of commitment to change. And so many young people came to Tanzania, for whatever reason, drawn by the possibilities of change. And while I was there, I got employed, luckily, at the university in January '68 in education. And I had become enamored, of course, as many young people, with the Arusha Declaration, Education for Self-Reliance. And I was teaching in education and wrote a paper on Kappa methods of teaching and trying to promote education for self-reliance. And I came across Paulo Freire. So I wrote to Paulo Freire and I sent him a copy of the Education for Self-Reliance paper by Nyerere. And I said, Paulo Freire, I think it'd be great if you could come and visit. So to tell you the truth, his first visit, he came as a personal visitor and actually stayed at my humble house at the University of Dar es Salaam, corresponding road. And then he was introduced to everybody in adult education and so on. And later he was given a much more formal invitation. But that is how open and genuine practitioners of animation, participating education are. Paulo Freire was quite happy to come at the invitation of a very junior scholar and activist to join us. And then, even as I was at the university, I was getting the opportunity to work with people doing the early examples of animation in Tanzania. That includes a project called Jipe Moyo, working on West Bagamoyo, Elimu Ufundi, which is working around the country through the Christian Council of Tanzania, putting it into practice. And then I began to do my own research in secondary schools, working with secondary school search, until we got kicked out by the Ministry of Education. Why did we get kicked out? Because they said we were promoting a different policy from the government. But what was the policy they were talking about? It's simply that the teachers were demanding or wanting an association of their own. And that was the issue. Later, I was doing research. In fact, all the rest of my research was really in the rural areas, especially in Rungwe and West Bagamoyo. And I will forever be grateful for the people that I have worked with locally at those places, because they are the ones, and I think people like Mabale and Grace and Bud will agree with me, they are the ones who teach us what it means to talk about about animation, about participatory action research. So if I can continue, this one is just summarizing what everybody's been saying. Mwalimu advocated transformative pedagogy and liberating adult education, but he linked it always to people-centered participatory development, that adult learners have knowledge to share, and we have to work with them in analyzing it, supporting them critically, but constructive criticism as being a part of their community. And while referring to individual demands for freedom and dignity, Mwalimu emphasized the collective nature of these demands and argued that the African people can only realize real democracy and freedom by uniting together so as to fight against neocolonialism and corporate globalization, and to struggle instead for equitable, just development and economic liberation. And he never stopped that struggle until he left us. He did it through the South-South Commission and many other ways. So this participatory methodology is, as we mentioned, many of us have mentioned, is what in Tanzania we call animation or Arabic. How it is facilitating dialogue, advocacy, and participatory action among the communities in which they work. So I'm asking this question to all of us. How prepared are we and they to put into practice Nyerere's call for liberating adult education in solidarity with the people? And I would answer to that question that Peter raised at the beginning. This is the very moment it's most relevant to talk about Nyerere's philosophy of participatory education, theory and action together, when we are fighting a very strong neoliberal globalization, but one which is definitely in crisis. What's fascinating when you go through the old documents, which I was doing for this paper, is that in Educate for Self-Reliance, he is emphasizing the basic principles of people-centered development, saying the educational system is not designed to produce robots which work hard but never question what the leaders in government or TANU are doing and saving. He's talking about the leaders of government and the party ought to be the servants of the people. And we all know we are in a period of authoritarianism until today. So this is a real challenge for us. ESR principles were advocated for both schooling and adult education. In his speech on adult education development, Mwalimu summarized the key principles of what we call Ragabish. The organizers, this is quoting, the organizers and teachers in adult education have consciously to identify themselves with those who are participating in it primarily as learners. Only on this basis of equality and of sharing a task, sorry, I need to have something, of sharing a task which is of mutual benefit, is it possible to make full use of the existing human resources and development of a community, a village, or a nation. Liberating pedagogy, Nyerere emphasized, has a political agenda, a revolutionary agenda, and he used the concept of agitation. He said adult educators will be known as agitators. In that adult education development paper, he said the first function of adult education, as I think Bud just referred to, is to inspire both a desire for change and an understanding that change is possible. An understanding that change is possible. So for example, I'm in a transformative feminist movement. And our job, our understanding is we don't go to bemoan, oh, how terrible patriarchy is and so on and so on. It's rather you work with people at the community level, women and men, because you're talking about gender equality, in a context of neoliberal globalization. You look at what the strengths are in the community and what are their problems and what are their priorities, what do you want to change? And what do you have as resources with which to work for that change? Human resources, not first money, human resources, organizing community resources. And so he goes on to say, dissatisfaction with what is must be combined with a conviction that it can be changed. Otherwise, it is simply destructive. Men living, and he did have a problem of only using men, but anyway, men living in poverty or sickness or under tyranny or exploitation must be enabled to recognize both that the life they lead is miserable and that they can change it by their own actions, either individually or to cooperation with others. So his concept was a contentious education process, which promoted revolutionary struggle. Some of us have already started referring to Professor Isa Shifji, who likes to talk about democracy actually is about struggle. He would focus on class struggles, whereas some of us focus on the intersectionality of class, race, gender, and all together. But the Musoma resolution said very clearly, and I'm quoting, education ought to enable whoever acquires it to fight against oppression. And he did a self-critique. We have not succeeded in liberating ourselves mentally, nor in having self-confidence, nor in selecting that which is most suitable to our objective conditions, instead of continuing to ape the systems of other people whose economy and mode of life is totally different from ours. That is contention. What about animation? and transformative feminism. I don't really say much about transformative feminism, but the main thing is about its intersectionality. I think that Anna Grace was referring to it. But the point about animation, as others, and especially Buddies just said, is it's breaking down the barrier between research and action. It's understanding that the so-called poor, the marginalized, the most uneducated, marginalized women are the owners of the action process, and they are knowers. Our job is not to educate them as some westernized, I'm talking about Tanzanians women who say, I'm going to go to the village and educate women about their oppression. That is not animation. It's about going to listen to the people in the countryside. How are they dealing with issues of male dominance? And how do they connect that with global imperialism and so on and so on? Participatory action research involves a reversal of power relations within the research process, as well as within different levels of society. The main goal is social change, not the collection of information. Because we've seen how the World Bank, I mean, just because it's the epitome of global imperialism, the World Bank suddenly became enamored of participatory research. It has rapid participatory appraisals, but it is extractive research in order to know better how to rule and extract the resources of the world. That is not what we are talking about. The key actors are expected to set the research agenda, including what are the priority issues. Analysis tends to be holistic and in-depth in order to provide the kind of rich information needed. And here I'd like to introduce the concept of empowerment. Now, there's a lot of use of the concept of empowerment, which really is very neoliberal, individualistic. It's about creating female entrepreneurs who are economically empowered individually, so they join the class of the capitalist exploiters. This actually began within UNICEF as a concept, and then TGMP adopted it itself. And this quote is to our own study of gender in Tanzania. The empowerment which results in the context of transformation is understood to be a process which increases the capacity of the poor and disempowered to analyze and know the world at all levels, to act on their own behalf. I think that's the most important line there, to act on their own behalf. So the role of the facilitator is to facilitate that process using AAA, we call it, assessing the situation, analyzing basic causes, underlying and root causes, deciding what is the priority for action, what can we change ourselves with our resources, and act. And so then we have act on their own behalf, increase their power and control over the resources necessary for sustainable and dignified life. It's not enough to just say, we're going to go provoke people to think for themselves, to speak their minds. We can write our books about it. According to what Nyerere talks about, according to our own understanding, we ought to have a change taking place in those structures of power. People-centered democracy is an alternative to neoliberal globalization. As everyone, I think, has been saying, education for self-reliance calls for a revolution, not only in the classroom in the school, but throughout society. A complete transformation in how people govern themselves and how they organize process of production, reproduction. The people were not to be robots who never question what the leaders are doing and saying. Mwalimu was calling for an entirely different form of leadership, one which would be participatory. Transformative education is also linked in his view to people-centered democracy and development. Now, I didn't have time or space to put in this PowerPoint a quote that I do have in the paper I prepared for this. A speech he made in 1966 in Mafia. He was touring in Mafia, and he invited people to ask him questions, and nobody spoke. And he said, everywhere I go, I ask people to give me questions and nobody speaks. I won't bother looking for the quote, but and he said, this is not the kind of leadership we want. Don't be afraid of your leaders. You ask them questions. Your leaders are your servants. And I think that is a way he was trying to get people to understand leadership all the way through his work. And I think that's why his concepts of an education for self-reliance and liberating adult education really are very political if you connect it to issues of organizing within the politics, within the party, within the community, for some of us within the family, etc. So this is quoting him. This was at an impromptu teach-in, I think at the university. I have it down in my paper, in '67. In Tanzania, this means we must safeguard and strengthen our democratic procedures. We must get to the position where every citizen plays an active and direct role in the government of his local community, at the same time as he plays a full role in the government of his own country. It also means we have to correct the glaring income differentials which we inherited from colonialism, and ensure that the international imbalance between the wages of factory and service workers on one hand and of agriculture workers on the other is not reproduced within our nation. Well, he was comparing factory workers with agricultural workers at that time, because I guess at that time, regular hired factory workers are kind of in the higher levels. But we know the income gaps that exist north and south are atrocious, totally unequal. And I think that's how we should interpret what he's talking about. And then he made this marvelous speech to the Nigerian Institute of International Affairs in 1986, where he says at some stage, yes, policy mistakes by our young governments or the existence of shameful corruption in many countries is not sufficient explanation for Africa's current economic condition. Although all African governments differ in ideology, policy, and structure, all countries have suffered a similar kind of economic regression and now face similar problems. Now he's saying that is 1986. In Tanzania, the whole World Bank, IMF led struggle against Tanzania's socialism and so on, pointed fingers at the falls in agriculture, some of the challenges in nationalized industries and so on, to suggest that there was a mistake with those policies. But here's his answer. I believe that the basic explanation for Africa's present economic condition lies in the fact that no African country has yet managed to shake off the neo-colonial hold of industrialized nations over our economies. Africa therefore continues to have an unequal dependency relationship with the developed nations, mostly former colonial powers. So he's not excusing corruption, inefficiency, and so on, but he's saying, how can you have a Kenya, a Tanzania, a Nigeria, so many other countries with very different ideologies, but suffering from some of the same issues or problems? What we hold in common is the global capitalist system. And he was invited, he was given probably I forget what you call it, a degree at Urbino University in Italy in '94. And this is in the collection put together by the Nyerere Foundation. I think it's called something about the South and the New World Order. The South and the North together. And here he is talking about the issue of democracy at the international level. So when we talk about people-centered development, his challenge to us is we are not just talking about feel-good work at the community level or even at the national level. It's an international issue. We all live in one world. I'm quoting, we have of necessity created systems to regulate or govern our relationships one with another. Yet at the moment, there is no democracy at all at the international level when countries of both North and South are involved. Instead, the international institutions we now have give added strength to the already strong and powerful. And yet while democracy continues to be urged at the national level, I think he's talking in the context of the pressure to accept structural adjustment and all that went with it, including political arrangements and so on. While democracy continues to be urged at the national level, international governance is being made ever more undemocratic. Increasingly, issues with any connection to economics are being transferred to the World Bank or IMF, or now to the new World Trade Organization. Control over the global environment facility was thus given not to the UN Environment Program based in Nairobi, but to the World Bank. What happens will not depend upon the interests of the majority, but on the wishes of the rich minority. And then this is a continuation of his quote, but I put it in the title. Democracy must be applied internationally as well as nationally, and the people of the North have to give it a chance. All of us, Black, white, brown, and yellow people, have to work together for peace and harmony in this one world in which we all live. But nationally or internationally, peace cannot be imposed. For genuine peace is a product of justice. Let us dedicate ourselves to work for peace through justice for all human beings. Thank you very much. Now I would like to close the share. I'm not sure. Or maybe you people know how to close the share.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marjorie Mibuni. It's an honor to be in contact with you. I read your work in the past on Tanzania, of course. Can
somebody help me to close the share? I don't really know.
I'll leave that to Joseph. But we're open now for discussion. The two presentations, our last two presentations, can make it today, cannot make it. So this is the last discussion of our afternoon dedicated to Mwalimu. Please come in, butt in, intervene. Joseph.
Oh, I see it.
There we go.
Joseph,
Right.
Joseph, okay, you got rid of the share. Okay, but you're looking better like that. We can see you all, half. So, as I was, yeah.
Yeah, now I'm okay.
So any, come on, questions, interventions? Don't force me to put in questions. I say this to the students, actually. Otherwise, it will be very similar. To
hi, teacher. This is Nishat. I'm sorry, I'm joining with my work Zoom.
Nishat?
Yes, I'm sorry, I'm working with my work Zoom.
It's from Bangladesh. These are our international students which we had. Now I'm finished with that program. Nishat, you've got a question?
Not exactly a question. I was thinking
or whatever, intervention, a statement, whatever.
Yes, I was thinking more about like the contextual features of Nyerere's philosophies, because I was thinking how Nyerere's ideologies about unification, about democracy can be applied in the context of India or Bangladesh. And while unification through, I was about to ask this question after the last presentation, which was listed in the timetable, but apparently that presentation is not happening, I think, anymore. So it takes us back to the language issue. So Nyerere proposes promoting unification through language. And when I look back to the context of Bangladesh, as Iris mentioned earlier, there's a standardization of Bengali language. And with that standardization, I have observed that there is a failure of quality education, where the indigenous children are not getting access to primary education because, or dropping out of school because the primary education are not conducted in their own mother tongue. So that's also one of the main reasons of failure of the MDG and the EFA goals in Bangladesh and countries like Bangladesh. So I was thinking like I see how the unification through language can come in like context like India, where the standardization of English or the use of English as a national language actually did promote some form of unification among different regions of India. But in the Bangladeshi context, I see more division and more marginalization for using language as a unifying tool. So I would love if someone could address how Nyerere ideologies can be addressed in language policies in this context.
Language policies and Nyerere. I mean, there's much to say about that. I'm sure people are much more better versed than I am on this. Over here.
Could I say something on that?
Yes.
First of all, I'm I'm really happy to hear someone from Bangladesh, because the animation which was introduced to Tanzania and which is carrying forward Nyerere's ideas was actually started in Bangladesh. The primary founder was Anisur Rahman, who I think was a professor at university, but was very, very committed to animation. And I was very lucky to hear him speak when he was invited to Tanzania to explain the philosophy of animation to UNICEF. That's by the way. With regard to the language policy, as I said a bit earlier, I think Nyerere changed his thinking to some extent. Firstly, when struggling for independence, when fighting against colonialists, Nyerere deliberately used Swahili, not any other language, and therefore translated what was mainly a coastal language into the language of liberation, which everyone wanted to learn. And because Swahili is related to the majority of other languages in Tanzania, it was relatively simple for people to learn Swahili. Adult education and primary education were also taught in Swahili, which continued to cement Swahili as a national language, not only a national language officially, but a natural national language, which was spoken by the majority of Tanzanians and continues to be spoken by more and more. With regard to secondary and higher education, Nyerere was more ambivalent. So at present, when children move into secondary school, the language of instruction is changed to English. And originally, Nyerere defended this by saying that English was the Swahili of the world. And so we needed it. And he was afraid that if we moved to Swahili, English would be lost. However, later on, by about 1995, he changed his mind and said he now reckoned that Swahili could be the medium of instruction. And this is now one of the major debates going on in Tanzania between those who insist that we need English because it's the international language, and those of us who insist that the first principle of education is to understand what you're being taught, not to learn another language. And since we have now moved to universal secondary education, and as said by Professor Bud and others, with the rapid expansion of education in Tanzania, it has now become very serious as only a very small minority of children going into secondary schools have enough English to be able to follow their subjects in English. So we are hoping that in the new curriculum, which will come out at the end of this year or the beginning of next year, the language of instruction will change. I don't know whether that answers the question. Huh?
Yes, thank you so much. That was a very helpful insight.
Okay. Anybody else?
Heribert has his hand up.
Peter, may I allow to speak?
Yes, everybody's allowed to speak. It's an open mic.
And it's directed to you.
To whom?
As the editor of Convergence, and me as a member of the editorial board, I would like to invite Marjorie to develop her presentation of the day into a full paper for the next issue of Convergence. I think it will be something very, very important to bring out what we discussed here today and thereby raise all that visibility which you have been doing and trying through Convergence and the Global Chair also. So Marjorie, please.
And we will have...
Get ready and write. Thank you so much. I enjoyed it a lot.
Yeah.
Very much, as long as you don't expect to be a very academic paper with lots of footnotes.
Convergence is not...
Because I've left all that.
Marjorie, I will send you a copy of the last issue, and then you have a look at it. And it's a low-level academic exercise.
Okay, thank you. And I've always enjoyed Convergence. It's also provided space in the past, as you know.
No, it has to have a delicate balance between practitioner knowledge, practitioners who are not academics, and of course academics, but who have to write in a non-demystifying way, which actually many good...
We are practical academics.
I call us scholar activists.
Scholar activism, yes. And it's open access. Of course, when we talk about open access, we have to be careful because we're assuming that everybody has access electronically. There's such a thing called the digital divide, and that we are aware of. And, you know, we're open to discussions as to how to counter that. Just an aside, people have mentioned other great thinkers from Africa. One person who I expected to be mentioned more, Bud mentioned him actually, is Nkrumah, Kwame Nkrumah. I mean, I would be very interested to learn more about his ideas about Pan-Africanism or Afrocentrism or you know, an indigenous education. Because I'm sure he must have had ideas along these lines. So, you know, I mean, it's otherwise the pieces you quoted, Marjorie, from Nyerere, of course, you find that in the literature, etc. I mean, it puts him in a whole stream of, I would say, intellectuals, some of whom suffered with their life. In fact, the North-South combination reminds me of the speeches of Maurice Bishop. In fact, of course, Maurice Bishop died the way he died, you know, the revolution was trampled over.
Yeah.
As my good friend Didicus Jules would say. Also involved with the ICA Task Force on Literacy. Yeah. So these are people we you know, like I personally try to bring in through activities of the chair. Of course, my personal values come into play. We are not neutral. And, you know, I mean, I'm looking for the day when we celebrate the work of, and we'll find out, it doesn't have to be a birth centenary, celebrate the work of Ada Gobetti, a partisan, an educator, literary scholar, but devoted her life to education after the war, but fought Nazism also on the fields as one of the coordinators of the resistance movement against Nazi fascism. Another one would be Gabriela Mistral. Her actual name is Lucila Godoy Alcanga, but she took after her two favorite poets, Mistral and D'Annunzio, Gabriele D'Annunzio, known as Gabriele, of course, showed that Latin America is not just Freire. Okay, I'm not detracting from Freire's contribution, but there's more to Latin America than just Freire. So, you know, we'll be looking at these situations to take adult education away from the dominant, of course, not in ours, not us here, the dominant human resource obsession, to revive that kind of idea of adult education and emancipation, if you like. Much abused word these days.
Peter?
Yeah, Bud?
Yeah, just a couple of thoughts. One is that Marge mentioned the name Isa Shivji. Isa, in those early days, as Marge, you and I all remember, Isa was, you know, was one of the very engaged, you know, I would say critical scholars of Mwalimu's work. You know, the silent class struggle is the book I remember, but later on became the Mwalimu Nyerere Chair at the University of Dar es Salaam, and he and a couple of other colleagues have done just a remarkable 3-volume biography of Mwalimu's life. And for those of you who would like to get a much fuller picture, not as good. Isa, unfortunately, was not as good on the educational side. He was really good on the politics, you know, and so forth. But it's a well written biography. So if you Google it, so you know, you'll find it. Unfortunately, it's not open access. You have to buy it, and it's quite expensive. But it's
obviously you get the university library in our case. Yes,
but it's a wonderful. I really recommend it. One of the things in there is of course, Nyerere was in touch with Nkrumah and with all of the, you know, the independence leaders. He knew them all personally. They had met. Some of them had met when they were overseas as students. Some of them met in these congresses, the famous Manchester Congress, and all of these things. And so, and Nkrumah and Nyerere weren't best friends. They apparently, Nkrumah thought that Nyerere was he wondered if Nyerere was a bit soft, you know, on the struggle. But I think Nkrumah misread Nyerere, because I think one of the things about Nyerere is that he was able to articulate complex, radical ideas in language which were quite accessible to a very large number of people. And in doing so, he refrained from a lot of either ideological jargon or hyper ideological jargon, or certainly academic jargon. And
it's very clear.
It's very clear, and I think
it's no translation. It's his English.
It says he writes in English, and so I think that Nkrumah, you know, missed the point of and underestimated the impact. And in fact, Nyerere's ideas, I would argue, have gone on to you know, to have much more impact
on policy in particular.
Yeah, then oh, there it is. There's the Nyerere. Good, very good. Thanks, Mark. That's the title. It's called Development and Revolution. Is that what it says? Yeah, very nice. Very good.
Man and Development, I remember. Freedom and Socialism. Those
there are 3 authors.
Development as Rebellion.
And Ingwanza Kamata.
Yeah.
I'll order them even for myself, to the Work Resource Fund, but to the library for sure. Yeah. Anyway, we need more of this to bring forward people from quote unquote the South globally.
Oh, the other point I was going to make is that, in the, of course, I live in Canada now, and the kind of work, that Anissa Rahman and Marjorie and Richard and Maria Lisa Swans were doing around, what they've called animation in Tanzania, but it's called other kinds, participatory research and so forth. Has in the last sort of 10 or 15 years, it's become quite trendy in higher education in Europe and North America. When these ideas first were promoted in the 70s and 80s, no university, not a single university, was interested, in this stuff. And I can tell you many, many stories how disrespected this kind of work was. But the irony of it is that when a number of people, particularly in the US, started finding out about this stuff, there are a lot of people in Canada and in Europe and in England and other places, they think that these ideas are all coming out of Europe and North America, when in fact they're not. The foundations for this kind of work, this thinking about knowledge as the creation of knowledge, the use of knowledge as a liberatory practice, is a product of the global South, and for a very good reason. And we can go into that another time, but
I remember a critique written by a prof from Mexico, actually, passed away. Highly revered in Mexico, Pablo Latapi, about participatory action under Kazim Bacchus, who was my supervisor for my master's thesis. He just brings this out, and you can sense the sense of skepticism with regard to participatory action. It reminds me of cultural studies, actually. Cultural studies became very, very trendy, to put it mildly, especially in North American universities. People do acknowledge, and Raymond Williams emphasizes, that it started in adult education in the work carried out by Richard Thompson, A.P. Thompson, Richard Thompson's a folk singer, A.P. Thompson, and Raymond Williams, Richard Hogarth, teaching adults in the evening in the Oxford Delegacy for Extramural Studies. But now it's made it into academia, and they falsify the origins of it. I mean, Raymond Williams has a famous quote about that. There's a famous line about it. So very similar. These things which are new, the germs of tomorrow are present today. Or today they are laughed at, derided. Some ideas about where the university is going, alternative universities. Nobody takes them seriously. Okay, they could be the universities of tomorrow, very much on the lines of Mwalimu's philosophy, community-oriented, particularly. So that's the way of the world, alas. Anybody else has an intervention to make? No, then I do. I'm going to call this this initiative and this activity to a close. I'd love to thank everybody who participated, even people I've been coaxing to present. They did not, but they came on very powerfully and made their voice heard. Yeah, well, yeah, okay, I know, I'm talking about you. All right.
I know.
I know. I mean, when I think of Africa, always Marjorie, sorry, it was Catherine or Laura Hoppers. Well, anyway, yeah, you gave a presentation, you see, by doing so, and you lost an impact. Hope to see you when we do something else next.
Yeah.
Thanks very much,
Thank you.
everybody.
We look for the moment, and not necessarily centenaries. We look for the moment.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
you.
Goodbye.
Thank you
Bye,
very much.
everybody.
And thanks for
Bye.
everything. Have a good time.